Warren Hudson called a towing company at 4 in the afternoon, and the first 4 words out of his mouth were not, "My friend is missing." That is where this update starts. Not with Horn Island, not with the boat, not with the reward money that would eventually climb past 6 figures. It starts with a phone call to a private tow service, a call that exists on tape, a call you can go listen to yourself right now if you know where to look, and a call in which the missing person at the center of this entire case is never mentioned once. Keep that in your head. We're going to come back to it more than once tonight because almost everything that has happened in the 5 weeks since has been an argument about what that silence means. This is the next installment in our ongoing file on Nolan Wells, and if you are new here, welcome, but you should know this series does not do one-and-done true crime videos. We built this channel on the promise that we follow a case until it actually resolves, not until it stops trending, and we label every claim in this script one of 2 ways as we go. Confirmed, meaning it comes from a named source, a document, a recording, or on-the-record reporting we can point you to, or alleged, meaning somebody said it, and we have not been able to verify it independently. If a claim doesn't fit cleanly into either bucket, we will tell you that too, out loud on camera, instead of quietly picking a side and hoping you don't notice. That is the whole premise of this series, and as of this recording, in the second week of August 2026, we are going to hold to it even when it slows us down. Before we go further, subscribe to this channel if you want the next update the moment it drops, because this case is not close to finished, and neither are 2 others we are going to connect to it tonight for the first time. Here is the shape of what we actually know, confirmed, no speculation before we get into the parts that are still open. Nolan Xavier Wells was 18 years old. He graduated Ocean Springs High School in Mississippi in 2025 as a multi-sport athlete and went on to play wide receiver at Southwest Mississippi Community College. On the 4th of July, 2026, he went out to Horn Island, a barrier island roughly 10 miles off the Mississippi Gulf Coast that sits inside a federally protected national seashore, for a holiday gathering that drew, by most estimates, around 300 people. It matters to be clear about what kind of place Horn Island actually is, because Barrier Island undersells how isolated it is. It has no public ferry service, no infrastructure, and no way on or off except by private boat, which means every single person who was there that day arrived and left the same way Nolan's group did, self-organized, on someone's personal vessel, with no official presence managing entry or exit at any point. He went with a group of friends he had known since high school, several of whom are white, including a friend named Warren Hudson. At some point that afternoon, the group's boat developed a mechanical problem. The friends left the island without Nolan. He was reported missing that night. His body was recovered in the water just off Horn Island on the morning of July 6, 2 days later, found face down. Those are the facts nobody disputes. Everything after that sentence is where the case splits into 2 stories that cannot both be entirely true. Start with the boat call, because it is the single piece of this case you can go verify with your own ears instead of taking anyone's word for it, ours included. The Mississippi Department of Marine Resources released audio in late July of a call placed from the boat to Sea Tow, a private towing company, at approximately 4 o'clock that afternoon. In it, a young male voice tells the dispatcher, quote, "Hey, we're at the west tip of Horn, and our bilge pump stopped working. We're sinking." That is the confirmed transcript, released by a state agency, reported by WLOX and multiple other outlets. Sea Tow ultimately never towed the boat. In a statement given to NBC News, the company said that before assistance was rendered, the vessel owner advised that Sea Tow was no longer needed because help had already been obtained. Jonathan Gilliam, a retired FBI special agent who also served in Navy SEAL and Federal Air Marshal roles before moving into media commentary, reviewed the audio publicly and said it did not reveal, in his words, anything nefarious, describing what he heard as consistent with teenagers handling a genuinely sinking boat in the middle of a party atmosphere rather than anything staged. Gilliam made a specific logical point that deserves its own mention. Placing an actual emergency call to a towing company in the middle of an alleged cover-up would be a strange, self-defeating thing to fake, since it creates a time-stamped, third-party record of exactly where the boat was and what its occupants were doing. A forensic audio analyst separately pushed back on unverified claims, some of which circulated on TMZ and elsewhere, that an enhanced version of the recording captured distress sounds or additional voices. Crump has said his team has retained what he's described as some of the nation's top forensic audio engineers to review the full, unedited CTO recording. A real, confirmed retention, even though the reporting we found doesn't name the specific firm or individuals involved, which limits how much weight we can put on their conclusions until they're actually published under a name we can check. As of this recording, we have not seen that enhancement independently verified by a named audio forensics expert whose credentials we could confirm, so we are labeling that claim alleged, not confirmed, and we are not going to play you audio we cannot stand behind. That is the discipline this series runs on, even when a juicier version of the story is one unverified claim away. Here's the part that should stop you, though, and it has nothing to do with enhanced audio. A boat is sinking. Or, at least someone on it says it is. And in the entire call, the caller never says a word about a missing teenager. Not we left someone behind. Not our friends stayed on the island. Nothing. Now, you could read that as completely unremarkable. Why would a distress call about a mechanical failure mention a friend who chose to stay on land? People call about the emergency in front of them. That's a fair read, and multiple people involved in this investigation, including that retired FBI agent, essentially make that argument. But you could also read it as the first data point in a pattern that repeats across this entire case. Information about Nolan Wells arriving late, arriving in pieces, and arriving only when someone else forced the question. We are not going to answer that one for you right now. Sit with it because it is going to come back. Now the story from the boat, as told by Warren Hudson across multiple interviews since. Hudson has said that Nolan chose to stay behind on Horn Island to spend more time with a young woman named Katie McCormick, and that Nolan told the group to go ahead without him, that he would find his own way back. That is Hudson's account, given on record, and we are labeling it precisely that. An account, alleged, not an established fact, because it is contradicted by someone who was, according to her own family, actually present for the conversation in question. That someone is Katie McCormick's older sister, Gracie. Speaking to the Daily Mail, Gracie McCormick said her sister's version of events does not match Hudson's. According to Gracie, Katie had a conversation and assumed that Nolan was getting ready to get on the boat he came out on, and critically, Katie assumed the friends telling him to get on the boat wouldn't have left him. Read that again. The version from inside Katie McCormick's own family is not that Nolan chose to stay. It's that Nolan believed he was leaving with the group, and that his sister-in-law's version, filtered secondhand, because Katie McCormick herself has not spoken publicly, directly undercuts the account that has anchored Warren Hudson's story from the beginning. Katie McCormick has not given her own on-record statement as of this recording. Everything from her side of this comes through her sister. It's worth adding the fuller context around her specifically, because fairness cuts here too. According to Gracie, Katie was actually on the island that day with a separate friend group of her own, not embedded with Warren Hudson's group, and left the island later with her brother and his fiancée. The family has said they've fully cooperated with investigators and with the Wells family directly. No allegation of wrongdoing has been made against Katie McCormick by anyone, including Crump, and Nolan's own family has reportedly voiced support for her rather than treating her as a suspect. She's a witness whose second-hand account complicates Warren Hudson's version of events, not a person under any kind of suspicion herself, and those are two very different positions to be in that shouldn't get flattened into the same category just because she's part of the same story. That matters, and we're not going to pretend it doesn't. A second-hand account is weaker evidence than a first-hand one, even when it points toward foul play, even when it's the version that makes the story make more sense. So you already have two irreconcilable accounts before we even get to the phone. Nolan's cell phone, and by most reporting, his keys stayed with the group that left the island. His mother tried calling him that evening and got no answer. When the family grew concerned, they used the Life 360 location sharing app, the confirmed method, reported across multiple outlets, to trace the phone's location to a home where some of the friends were staying. Nolan's mother and a family friend went to that residence to retrieve the phone. It reportedly took roughly 15 minutes for someone inside to bring it out. We want to be precise here. The 15-minute detail and the idea that the house was dark when they arrived come from family accounts relayed in the press, not from a police report we've been able to independently confirm, so we're keeping that in the alleged column, even though it's widely repeated. There's a specific detail buried in that phone recovery story that gets skipped over almost every time this case is summarized, and it's more concrete than the messages were deleted. According to the family, Nolan's Snapchat activity showed a gap of several hours with no posts or saved videos during that afternoon, described as out of character for someone who, by all accounts, used the app constantly. And when the family compared Nolan's location history as recorded by Life 360 against his location history as recorded by Snapchat for that same window, the two did not match each other. We want to be exact about what that means and doesn't mean. Location data pulled from different apps on the same phone can diverge for entirely mundane technical reasons. Spotty cell coverage on a remote barrier island, battery saving settings, an app simply not refreshing in the background. Here's how Life 360 actually determines a location in the first place, because mundane technical reasons isn't just a hand wave, there's a real mechanism behind it. The app pulls from GPS satellites when the signal is strong, which is accurate to within 10 or 30 feet, but falls back on Wi-Fi positioning and cell tower triangulation when GPS is weak, and triangulation off cell towers alone can be off by hundreds or even thousands of feet. Horn Island is a remote, largely undeveloped barrier island with limited cell infrastructure. Exactly the kind of environment where a phone would be far more likely to be relying on that less precise triangulation method than on a clean GPS lock, particularly if it changed hands, changed pockets, or sat somewhere with a weaker signal for stretches of the afternoon. That's not us arguing the mismatch is nothing. It's us explaining precisely one entirely mundane way it could have happened, so that the location data doesn't match carries exactly the evidentiary weight it should, and not more. It is not, by itself, proof of tampering. But it is a second, independently sourced data point suggesting something happened to that phone's normal behavior during precisely the window everyone is trying to reconstruct, and it's a more specific claim than most coverage of this case bothers to make. Christine Wansley has described the moment of actually checking the phone herself in her own words, and it deserves hearing in her own exact words on Good Morning America. When we finally got his phone, me and my sister went through the phone. We went in his Snapchat. He had 2 accounts. Absolutely nothing. It wasn't even 24 hours, which is how long videos and pictures stay in Snapchat. Even my sister was like, yeah, that's suspicious. 2 separate Snapchat accounts, both completely empty, checked within the platform's normal 24-hour retention window rather than after it had already lapsed. That's a more specific and more immediate version of the gap than a lot of coverage of this case bothers to spell out. What is confirmed, because Ben Crump's team has said it directly, and it has been reported by multiple outlets, is that when the family regained possession of the phone, a number of Snapchat messages and text messages had been deleted from the period surrounding Nolan's disappearance. Who deleted them, when, and what they said, unknown. That is an open loop, and it stays open through this entire update. Before we get to the phone, there's a genuinely new lead in this case that broke in the first days of August, and it deserves to be treated as precisely what it is: new, not fully verified, and potentially significant. TMZ reported obtaining video footage recorded on Horn Island at 11:17 a.m. on July 4th, before the crowd built up, and separate footage timestamped 2:23 p.m. that afternoon. In both clips, a boat bearing the name Mac Daddy is visible. The person who filmed the material told TMZ they believed strongly enough that a man visible in the footage could be Nolan Wells that they brought a copy directly to the Jackson County Sheriff's Office, where it was left with a detective assigned to the case. According to GPS data cited in that same reporting, the boat carrying Nolan's friends left Horn Island at approximately 4:30 p.m., roughly 2 hours after the later clip was recorded, and returned to the mainland without him. We want to be careful with this one, because a boat that resembles one seen in earlier footage and confirmed identification of Nolan Wells at a specific time are not the same claim, and as of this recording, law enforcement has not publicly confirmed what, if anything, the footage shows or changes. What it does confirm, independent of any identification question, is that the departure time reported by Warren Hudson's account, the boat leaving around 4:30, lines up with the GPS data. That's one detail from Hudson's account that external, independently sourced data actually corroborates, and fairness means saying that as clearly as we say anything that complicates his account. For the record, The boat itself has been identified as a 22-foot, 2022 model Triton TRX, and GPS tracking shows it traveled back to a residence in Biloxi after leaving the island. A specific, checkable detail rather than a vague, "they went home." It's worth being transparent about specifically where Warren Hudson's own account has actually been delivered to the public, because it isn't a neutral venue, and treating it like one would be its own quiet distortion. Officer Tatum is Brandon Tatum, a former Tucson, Arizona police officer turned conservative political commentator, author, and co-founder of the Blexit movement, whose YouTube channel has millions of subscribers and a clearly stated ideological aim. That doesn't make anything Hudson says on that platform false. A claim's truth doesn't depend on where it's published, but it does mean every one of Hudson's multiple interviews has come through a single commentator with his own established editorial perspective rather than through neutral wire reporting. And a viewer following this case only through clips of those interviews is getting Hudson's account filtered through one specific lens every single time. Hudson has now given a third sit-down interview, published on Officer Tatum's YouTube channel, and it adds real texture to what happened after the boat docked, even if it doesn't resolve anything about the island itself. Hudson described the return trip as very chaotic, which he attributed to the boat taking on water, consistent with the sea tow call. After docking, he said the group went to a friend's house, ate, and napped for a while before heading to a young woman's 4th of July party elsewhere. He said he texted another friend, identified as Javon, to get Nolan's mother's phone number, and that once he had it, he called Christine Wansley around 11 that night to tell her what was going on, and that he intended to call the Coast Guard. That timeline, dock, eat, nap, go to a second party, and only then call the missing teenager's mother, is worth sitting with on its own, without extra commentary, because the sequence itself is the thing raising eyebrows, not any single word in it. Separately, a body language analyst who reviewed a clip of Hudson insisting no one touched Nolan's phone concluded the delivery showed signs consistent with deception. We're including that because it's part of the public conversation around this interview, but we want to be honest about its evidentiary weight, which is limited. Body language analysis is a widely used commentary tool in media coverage of high-profile cases, but it is not accepted as a scientifically validated method for detecting truthfulness in the way DNA or ballistics are. And no serious court process would treat it as proof of anything. Treat it as one commentator's read on a video, not as evidence. The search itself deserves its own honest accounting, because it's easy to assume law enforcement mobilized instantly and lose the actual mechanics of what a real search on a remote barrier island looks like. Nolan was last confirmed alive around 3 p.m. on July 4th, when he told the friend group he'd find his own ride back. The 3 p.m. last sighting time isn't anonymous, either. It traces back to Nolan's former high school football coach, Jake Bramlett, who was among the group on the island that day and has said he last saw Nolan around that time. Bramlett has separately played a real, on-record role in this case's misinformation problem and on the correcting side of it. He said publicly that he recognized the person shown in a different viral confrontation video circulating online and that it was not Nolan Wells at all. An identification that lines up with, and independently reinforces, Traciston Shepard's own denial that the confrontation clip involved Nolan's words or Nolan's voice. Two separate people who actually knew him, independently, corrected the same piece of misinformation. Even that 3 p.m. figure isn't as settled as most coverage treats it, though, and we'd rather flag the disagreement than round it off for a cleaner story. Some reporting places Nolan's last definitively corroborated sighting closer to 4:30, others as late as 6 p.m., depending entirely on whose account is treated as most credible. A recent independent analytical review of the case's available photographs, videos, GPS coordinates, and witness statements concluded there remains what it called a material gap in the timeline between Nolan's last independently corroborated sighting and the boat's reported departure, which is a careful, technical way of saying that even after 5 weeks and dozens of pieces of evidence, nobody has actually closed the loop between last seen and boat left without him. That gap, not any single piece of audio or tissue, is the actual center of this entire case. His family got a call from one of his friends around 11 p.m. that night and reported him missing. By the next morning, July 5th, Christine Wansley had posted on social media asking for help finding her son, and that post is, by most accounts, the actual turning point that pulled outside search and rescue resources into the case. The Jackson County Sheriff's Department began coordinating with the Coast Guard and, as her post gained traction online, with the United Cajun Navy, a Louisiana-based volunteer search and rescue nonprofit that has become a recurring name in exactly this kind of case. It matters to know where that organization actually comes from, since it isn't a group formed for this case precisely. The Cajun Navy traces back to Hurricane Katrina in 2005, when a Louisiana state senator publicly asked private boat owners to head toward New Orleans to help rescue stranded residents, an effort credited with helping roughly 10,000 people during that storm alone. The United Cajun Navy formally organized as a 501c3 nonprofit in 2018 and has since recruited close to 5,000 volunteers and deployed to at least 28 disasters across 19 states, donating well over £1 million of supplies along the way. That's a genuinely established, credentialed disaster response organization, not an ad hoc group of amateurs who showed up because a case went viral, which matters when you're weighing how much to trust its rip current theory and its independently produced 22-page report. The Mississippi Department of Marine Resources launched 2 drone flights over the western side of Horn Island that same afternoon, and both were cut short because the heat caused the drone's batteries to swell, a small, almost absurd mechanical detail that nonetheless meant real search hours were lost to equipment failure rather than anyone's negligence. His body was recovered the following morning, July 6th, by a National Park Service ranger, who found him on the island's northwestern tip, the federal agency that actually administers Horn Island as part of the Gulf Islands National Seashore, which is a separate detail from the FBI's involvement and worth not conflating with it. On August 6th, the United Cajun Navy released its own report on its search findings, along with new photographs, adding an independent, non-law enforcement account of the search to the public record. It's a substantial document, 22 pages, compiling material sent in by the organization's own followers, photos and screenshots pulled from videos shot on Horn Island on July 4th, annotated with GPS coordinates and cross-referenced against social media posts, along with a working timeline of the day's events and an accounting of how many boats were on the island and how they moved. It also lays out specific recommendations for what evidence investigators should still be collecting: social media photos and video, the electronics recovered from the boats themselves, cell phone data, and separate individual interviews with everyone involved, rather than group accounts given together. UCN Vice President Brian Troshers described the goal plainly: to produce something digestible that organizes everything the group has received rather than leaving it scattered across hundreds of individual tips. That a volunteer nonprofit felt the need to compile and publish its own 22-page investigative document 5 weeks into an open law enforcement case tells you something on its own about how much of the public record in this case has been assembled from the outside in rather than the inside out. A few of the report's specifics deserve pulling out directly rather than leaving as a vague reference. Its working timeline of July 4th begins before 3:23 p.m. and runs into the evening, built from everything UCN's volunteer network sent in. Page 12 of the report includes a photograph showing 3 boats anchored side by side that afternoon, identified in the report as boat number 3, a boat called the Palm Beach, and the Triton that Nolan came out on, and the report independently confirms, consistent with the GPS data reported elsewhere, that the Triton left the island at 4:31 p.m. The report frames what it considers the single most pressing open question in the entire case, in almost exactly the terms this update has used tonight: what happened between the last confirmed sighting of Nolan Wells and 4:31 p.m., when the boat he arrived on departed without him. A volunteer search and rescue nonprofit, working from crowdsourced photos and public GPS data, with no subpoena power and no badge, arrived independently at the same central question professional investigators, the family's legal team, and this series have all landed on. That convergence, from completely different directions and completely different resources, is itself a data point worth noting. This case has also become something the town of Ocean Springs itself is visibly wrestling with, and that's worth its own honest look rather than treating the investigation as though it's happening in a vacuum. Hundreds of people gathered in Ocean Springs on July 12th at the intersection of Government and State Streets, a peaceful demonstration, by all reporting, calling for transparency in the investigation rather than presuming a specific outcome. Tracy Lampley, who coached Wells during his time playing football at Ocean Springs High School, described a community trying to pull together and be supportive to his family, but they're still just in disbelief. Not every voice in that community agrees on what the moment means, though. Resident Nay Davis has pointed to a specific, local comparison: how differently Ocean Springs responded to Nolan Wells' death compared to its response to Aubrey Wyatt, a white Ocean Springs teenager who died by suicide in 2023, arguing the disparity in community support exposes something real about how race shapes even local, small-town grief. We're naming that comparison because a resident raised it on the record, not because a suicide and a still undetermined death are equivalent events. They aren't, and any real disparity in how a town rallies around two different families grieving two very different losses deserves to be examined on its own terms, not collapsed into a simple analogy. What's confirmed is that Ocean Springs has not experienced this case as background noise. It's happening on streets people in that town walk every day. This case has also reached well past domestic coverage. Canada's CBC News has run its own explainers asking, essentially, who Nolan Wells is and why his death has drawn this level of attention, which tells you the story crossed an international threshold most regional missing persons cases never come close to reaching. The demographic numbers deserve stating plainly rather than leaving as an impression, because they're specific and public. Ocean Springs is roughly 79.6% white and 7.6% black, and Ocean Springs High School, where Nolan and Warren Hudson both went, breaks down to roughly 70.8% white and 12.9% black. Nolan Wells grew up as part of a clear numerical minority in his own hometown and his own school. That fact doesn't tell you anything about what happened on Horn Island. It does tell you something true and specific about the community this entire story is unfolding inside of, instead of leaving small Mississippi town to do vague work it isn't equipped to do on its own. Ask yourself the question everyone in this case has been asking since the second week of July, and we're going to ask it in the plainest possible way. If an 18-year-old chooses, of his own free will, to stay on an island with no way off except by boat, why does he leave with no phone? People forget things. Phones get left in bags, in trucks, in the chaos of a group of 30 people packing up gear at the end of a holiday. That is a completely ordinary explanation, and it deserves to be said out loud instead of dismissed, because ruling it out just because it's boring is precisely the kind of shortcut this series refuses to take. But ordinary explanation and confirmed explanation are not the same thing, and nobody, not Warren Hudson, not the sheriff's office, not anyone on record, has offered a clean, verified account of exactly how and when that phone ended up staying behind. That absence, more than any single piece of audio or any autopsy line, is what has kept this story alive for 5 weeks. Here's why that specific detail, the phone, not the tow call, not the tissue, is the one that actually lands with people who've never set foot on Horn Island and never will. Almost everyone watching this has lived some smaller version of it. You've been the parent calling 3 times with no answer, running through a mental list of harmless explanations: dead battery, bad signal, phone on silent in someone's bag, while a colder possibility sits underneath all of them that you're actively trying not to think about yet. You've been in a friend group where something went sideways and felt that specific, ugly instinct to just not bring it up, to let it stay vague rather than ask the one direct question that would force everyone to actually deal with it. You've been in a group chat where someone said something they probably shouldn't have and watched or participated in the quiet, unspoken agreement to just let that message scroll away rather than address it. None of those small, universal, mostly innocent human behaviors are evidence of a crime on their own. Most of the time, they're just what people do when they're 18 or scared or don't want to be the one who makes things weird. That's precisely the point, and it's why this case is so hard to look away from. It's not built on anything exotic. It's built on the most ordinary human impulses: avoidance, self-protection, the instinct to smooth over an uncomfortable moment rather than sit in it, scaled up to a situation where one of those small, ordinary impulses might be sitting directly on top of the difference between an accident and something else. You don't need to have ever been to Mississippi or known anyone on that boat to recognize that feeling. That's what a 5-week-old case with no name attached to it, yet is actually asking you to sit with. Turn now to the body, because this is where the case stops being about a disagreement and starts being about a genuine medical unknown. Nolan Wells was found in the water on the morning of July 6th, roughly 41 hours after he was last confirmed alive. The Mississippi State Medical Examiner's Office conducted the first autopsy. Those results have not been made public. Jackson County District Attorney Angel Myers McElrath has said the autopsy materials will remain sealed until they are presented to a grand jury, a confirmed, on-record statement, and a genuinely standard practice in an active investigation, not evidence of concealment on its own, whatever your gut tells you when you hear the word sealed. And here's the most current development in this entire case, breaking only in the last 2 days, right at the edge of when we're recording this. Officials have now confirmed to NBC News that the state medical examiner's report is fully completed. The findings themselves are still sealed, per exactly the process just described, and still won't become public until a grand jury sees them. But completion is real forward motion after 5 weeks in which the autopsy still isn't even finished, was itself part of the case's central grievance. It doesn't tell us anything about what the report says. It does mean the single biggest procedural bottleneck in this case is just cleared, and whatever comes next, a grand jury date, a summary from the DA's office, an eventual public release, is now realistically closer than it has been at any point since July 4th. It's worth going back to the moment the family, Crump, and Sharpton first appeared together publicly, on July 10th, because the framing established that day is held for the entire 5 weeks since. Crump announced that his team was launching an independent investigation, including an independent autopsy funded, notably, in part by civil rights activist and former NFL quarterback Colin Kaepernick, and put the family's core grievance in terms he's repeated in nearly every appearance since. It's a lived experience for many Black Americans that oftentimes, when our children are killed in highly questionable situations, there is this notion that there was nothing wrong, no foul play, let's just sweep it under the rug. We refuse to let them sweep it under the rug. He also asked, at that same podium, the single question that has effectively anchored the entire public conversation about this case in the week since: what teenager would leave their phone behind if they're going to stay on this island? Sharpton's framing that day was narrower and more procedural than Crump's. It is clear that this situation must have the most thorough and objective investigation to lead to justice. The family, through Ben Crump, commissioned an independent, second autopsy. This is where we need to slow down and actually explain what undetermined means as a medical classification, because almost nobody covering this case bothers to, and it is doing an enormous amount of work in how people interpret the story. A medical examiner has essentially 4 boxes to check for manner of death: natural, accident, homicide, or undetermined. Undetermined is in a 5th, secret category that means probably foul play, but they can't prove it. It means exactly what it says. The available evidence does not clear the bar for any of the other 3. That can happen because something suspicious was found. It can also happen because the body was recovered from water after 2 days, because certain tissue wasn't available to examine, or because the toxicology screen wasn't back yet when the report was written. All 3 of those apply here, and we're going to walk through them one at a time instead of letting undetermined do your thinking for you. The independent autopsy was performed by Dr. Roger A. Mitchell, Jr., the former chief medical examiner for the District of Columbia, a credential important to state plainly because it means Dr. Mitchell has run a metropolitan medical examiner's office and testified as an expert in precisely this kind of case before, not that he's simply a doctor the family hired. Crump announced the preliminary findings on July 22nd at the NAACP National Convention in Chicago, which is itself worth noting. This was not a quiet filing, it was a public platform, and that choice tells you something about the strategy here even before you get to the medical content. That platform wasn't incidental. Days earlier, on July 18th, the NAACP's National Board of Directors had formally adopted a resolution of condolence for the Wells family, one that specifically calls on local, state, and federal authorities, including the U.S. Department of Justice, to conduct what the resolution describes as an in-depth and openly transparent review of how Nolan came to be left on the island and of everything that happened in the hours before his body was recovered. That's a distinct, institutional escalation, separate from anything Crump or the family have said individually. a national civil rights organization's governing board formally putting its own name behind a demand for federal review. NAACP President Derek Johnson went further at that same convention, telling the assembled press directly that investigators had been, in his words, derelict in their duties to follow up and to ensure that, regardless of what happened, there was a proper investigation. That's about as direct an institutional accusation as this case has generated from anyone outside the family's own legal team, and it came from the president of one of the oldest civil rights organizations in the country, not from a commentator or a lawyer paid to advocate for one side. Dr. Mitchell's report found no evidence of fractures or deep tissue injuries. It also found red discoloration in the soft tissue at the back of the head, with a cause undetermined. It could be trauma, it could be lividity, the ordinary pooling of blood after death, and Dr. Mitchell's own report does not resolve which. Crucially, Dr. Mitchell wrote that he could not rule out the possibility that, in his words, non-accidental factors contributed to or caused the death. That is a real, on-the-record, named source finding. It is also, by definition, not a conclusion, it is the absence of one. And here's where the credibility anchor for this entire segment matters most, because we told you at the top of this update that we hold every source to the same standard regardless of which side of the case they're helping. Dr. Mitchell's own report lists the limitations that produced the undetermined finding, and they're significant. He did not have direct access to examine the airway or the lungs for water, which is one of the central pieces of evidence in any drowning determination. He did not receive Nolan's internal neck structures, including the trachea, tissue that, according to the report, the state medical examiner's office retained. And at the time the preliminary report was written, toxicology results had not yet come back. As of late July, officials indicated the primary toxicology panels had been completed, but cautioned that more specialized secondary panels can take additional weeks beyond that on top of the backlogs that state crime labs across the country are, by all accounts, dealing with as a matter of routine, not as something specific to this case. Take those three limitations together and undetermined stops looking like a smoking gun and starts looking like exactly what a forensic pathologist should say when he's missing a third of the evidence he'd normally need. That's not us defending the state's handling of the tissue. We're going to get to why that retention itself is legitimately controversial in a minute. It's us refusing to let you walk away from this segment thinking undetermined is secretly a homicide finding in disguise. It isn't. It's an honest gap. Now look at this from a completely different angle than the autopsy report, because the physical geography of Horn Island is its own body of evidence, and it points somewhere genuinely complicated. A representative from the United Cajun Navy, the volunteer search and rescue organization that assisted in the search for Wells, offered a theory about the recovery location that deserves to be treated as exactly what it is, an informed field theory from someone with real search and rescue experience, not a lab-confirmed finding. According to that representative, Nolan's body was recovered near an area of Horn Island known for dangerous rip currents, and the working theory is that a rip current initially pulled him away from shore before a later change in the tide carried him back toward the beach, where he was ultimately found. That's a genuinely plausible, well-documented coastal phenomenon. Rip currents are one of the leading causes of ocean rescue incidents on the Gulf Coast every single year, and they are entirely capable of moving a body a meaningful distance over the course of 41 hours without any human involvement at all. That work is no longer just a stated intention. Crump's team has confirmed they are actively working with oceanic engineering experts to examine precisely this question: how and why Nolan's body was ultimately found in essentially the same location where he was last seen, rather than carried further by current or tide. The specific question those experts are working through is whether the documented tidal pattern for that stretch of coast on that specific day, the sequence of low tides and high tides between July 4th and July 6th, actually supports a body ending up back near its starting point after 41 hours in open water, or whether that recovery location is harder to explain by ocean movement alone than the rip current theory implies. As of this recording, we have not seen those experts publish named, independent findings yet, so we're marking the analysis itself as pending, not alleged and not confirmed, genuinely in progress rather than simply promised. Here's a genuine complication to that rip current theory, though, and it's the kind of detail that only shows up if you go past the initial headline and into the actual coastal science of this specific stretch of water. According to the National Weather Service, Rip currents along the beaches of the Mississippi Sound, the body of water between the mainland and the barrier islands, are actually quite rare, precisely because Cat Island, Ship Island, Horn Island, and Petit Bois Island themselves absorb and break the Gulf's incoming swell before it ever reaches the Sound side, keeping the wave action unusually low compared to open Gulf beaches. Rip currents remain a real and documented hazard, specifically on the Gulf-facing side of those same barrier islands, where the open ocean swell hits directly. So the question that actually matters isn't, were there rip currents near Horn Island in the abstract? It's which side of the island Nolan Wells was on and which side his body was recovered from, because those two locations carry meaningfully different baseline risk. We haven't found public reporting that specifies which shoreline, Sound side, or Gulf side the recovery location was on, which means the rip current theory is, as of this recording, resting on a detail nobody covering this case, including us until this update, has actually pinned down. Here's the question that same Cajun Navy representative raised publicly, though, and it doesn't need any forensic expertise to understand, only common sense about crowds. If Nolan Wells went into the water and became distressed anywhere near several hundred people gathered on a relatively small barrier island for a holiday, why did nobody see it happen? In the representative's own words, if he went into the water at all and became distressed, it was so crowded that day, it seems hard to believe that nobody would have noticed a distressed swimmer in the water. That's not a rhetorical trick. Drownings, especially in adults and older teenagers, are frequently far quieter and less visible than people expect. The popular image of a swimmer thrashing and shouting for help is, according to water safety researchers, often wrong. What's sometimes called the instinctive drowning response can look, from a distance, like someone simply treading water or floating, which is part of why lifeguard training spends real time teaching people to recognize it. A crowded beach is not the same as 300 pairs of eyes trained on the water at every moment. Most people at a holiday gathering are looking at each other, not scanning the surf. So the nobody saw it objection is real and deserves raising, and it is not, on its own, proof that something other than an accident occurred. It's a genuine open question sitting exactly where the tow call, the phone, and the tissue are sitting. Unresolved, pointing in more than one direction, and waiting on evidence nobody has produced yet. While we're correcting assumptions instead of just repeating them, there's a detail from this case that most channels covering it have either ignored or gotten backwards, and we'd be violating our own standard if we didn't fix it here. Multiple witnesses told investigators, according to reporting from ABC News, that Nolan Wells had been drinking heavily on Horn Island that day. That's a confirmed, on-record claim from named investigative reporting, not something we're inferring. If you've watched other coverage of this case, including commentary built directly from Warren Hudson's own interviews, you may have heard it claimed that a coach who spoke with Nolan later in the afternoon confirmed he was not intoxicated, and that this closes the question. We went back and checked that specific claim against the reporting we could find, and we cannot confirm it. There is no named, on-record coach statement in the reporting we reviewed that addresses Nolan's sobriety one way or the other. What we can confirm is the opposite. Witness accounts describing heavy drinking. We're flagging this correction deliberately on camera because getting a detail backwards and repeating it with confidence is precisely the failure mode this whole series exists to avoid, and it doesn't matter whether the error helps or hurts either side of the story. Wrong is wrong, and we'd rather tell you we were wrong on a prior pass than let it stand. Before we move past the medical evidence, here's an explanation of the legal mechanism the family's team has actually used to try to preserve digital evidence, because it's more concrete and more interesting than they subpoenaed some records. Crump's team opened a formal estate for Nolan Wells, with his mother designated as the estate's representative, a legal structure that exists, in ordinary circumstances, to manage a deceased person's property and affairs, but which also carries the legal standing to issue subpoenas. Using that standing, the family's attorneys have issued subpoenas that now extend well past Snapchat alone. Reporting from late July confirms subpoenas were also sent to TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, WhatsApp, and the relevant phone carriers and location data providers, seeking to preserve message content, deleted posts, and video footage from the period surrounding July 3rd through July 8th before any of it could be permanently lost. Christine Wansley has said directly that the family's concern deepened specifically because when they regained possession of Nolan's phone, his Snapchat account showed no photos or videos at all from that day. Not just some messages missing, but an entire expected visual record of a holiday absent on a platform he used constantly. This matters because of how Snapchat's platform actually works. Messages are designed to auto-delete, typically within 24 hours, which is precisely why any deleted Snapchat content from Nolan's phone before his family retrieved it is not necessarily gone forever. Platforms generally retain deeper backend data, accessible through a proper legal subpoena, well past what disappears from a user's own screen. That's a real, meaningful legal tool, not a symbolic gesture, and it's the mechanism by which investigators might eventually be able to recover exactly what was deleted and when, something no amount of public speculation about what the messages probably said can substitute for. It matters to be realistic about the actual technical odds here, though, because Snapchat's entire product is built around ephemerality in a way that works against exactly this kind of recovery. Under the platform's own stated policies, open messages are generally deleted once every recipient has viewed them, or automatically after roughly 30 days in conversations that were never opened at all, and while some metadata may persist longer, message content itself is engineered for rapid deletion by design, not as an afterthought. Snapchat does maintain a formal law enforcement legal request process and will honor valid subpoenas and preservation requests, but the window for that to actually work is narrow. Success depends heavily on how quickly a preservation request goes in relative to when the content was created, not just on whether a subpoena eventually gets filed. Translated plainly, the earlier the estate's subpoenas were filed relative to July 4th, the better the odds anything meaningful still exists to recover. We don't have a public timeline for precisely when those subpoenas went out, which is itself one more small piece of missing information in a case that has been defined by specifically that. We want to bring in a second, independent forensic voice here, someone with no financial or professional relationship to either side of this case, because we told you at the outset that we don't let a single narrative dominate a contested question. Nancy Grace, a former prosecutor who has spent close to 3 decades as a national legal commentator, currently hosting Crime Stories with Nancy Grace on Fox 1, has also weighed in publicly, and her framing deserves including precisely because she stakes out a middle position that neither dismisses the case nor declares it solved. Grace has said authorities did apparently jump the gun at the get-go by ruling out foul play before a real investigation had been done, while explicitly clarifying, "I'm not saying this is a homicide," pointing instead to what she calls a lot of disturbing circumstances, the head discoloration among them. She's also flagged the same phone data inconsistencies this update has walked through as part of what's kept her show returning to the case, saying on air, "We are not stopping until we know what happened to Nolan Wells." That's a commentator's public position, not a forensic finding, and we're labeling it precisely that, but it's a useful data point on how this case reads to someone whose entire career has been built on evaluating specifically this kind of ambiguous evidence for a living. On the other side of that same professional spectrum sits Jennifer Coffindaffer, another retired FBI agent who has reviewed the public evidence and reached a notably more settled conclusion than Grace's disturbing circumstances framing. When you add it all together, what we see publicly seems to be an accident, Coffindaffer has said, citing the available surveillance footage, witness accounts, Coast Guard communications, and the area's documented riptide conditions as the basis for that read. 2 former federal agents, both with real investigative backgrounds, looking at the same public record and landing in different places, Gilliam and Coffindaffer both leaning toward accident, Grace holding the door open to something else, is exactly the kind of genuine, credentialed disagreement this update owes you instead of picking whichever expert happens to agree with a predetermined conclusion. Forensic pathologist Dr. Carl Wigren, commenting publicly on the broader challenge these autopsies present, put it this way: there is no single medical finding that can reliably determine whether someone was conscious or unconscious, or whether they entered the water voluntarily or involuntarily. That's not a statement about Nolan Wells exactly. It's a statement about the actual limits of forensic science in drowning cases generally, and it cuts against certainty in both directions. It means neither "he definitely drowned by accident" nor "he was definitely killed and staged" can be stated as settled fact on the evidence made public so far. Anyone telling you they know for certain which one happened, on either side of this, is telling you more than the science currently supports. There's one more piece of hard science worth grounding this in, because it changes how you should read every undetermined finding in this entire update, not just Dr. Mitchell's. Forensic pathology literature is fairly blunt about this. Drowning is, in the field's own language, a diagnosis of exclusion. There is no single autopsy finding, no marker, no test, no piece of tissue that definitively proves someone drowned. Pathologists rule out everything else and land on drowning as what's left. Published research on bodies recovered from water describes the rate of undetermined manner of death classifications as unusually high in precisely this category of case, higher than almost any other cause of death, precisely because the evidence degrades in water and the diagnostic tools are inherently limited. That same body of research also notes something uncomfortable and directly relevant here. Adult drownings can, in some documented cases, conceal a physical altercation or an intentional act, and when the people involved are close in size and strength, as opposed to, say, an adult and a small child, where physical evidence of a struggle is much harder to hide. The signs of that altercation can be genuinely difficult or impossible to detect after the fact. None of that tells us anything about what specifically happened to Nolan Wells. What it tells you is that undetermined showing up in this case isn't an anomaly or a red flag on its own. It's close to the statistical norm for this exact category of death, which should adjust your expectations for what a conclusive autopsy result was ever likely to look like here in the first place. Now, about that retained tissue, because it deserves its own honest treatment instead of getting folded into the cover-up or dismissed as nothing. It is a genuinely established, if lesser known, forensic practice for a medical examiner's office to hold onto airway or neck tissue when there's a possibility that further sectioning or specialized examination might be needed. This isn't an invention specific to this case. But established practice and adequate communication are two different things, and the family's central grievance, as expressed through Crump, is not that the tissue was retained. It's that they say they were not adequately told why, or given a timeline for when the second examiner would get access to it. That's a legitimate, specific, checkable complaint, separate from whatever you believe about how Nolan died. And it's one more example of information arriving late in a case that has been defined, from the tow call forward, by information arriving late. If you're just now finding the series, here's how a case like this actually moves from missing to grand jury, because we're about to walk through that exact process, and we track every procedural update as it happens rather than after the fact. So, where does the official investigation actually stand as of this recording? Jackson County Sheriff John Ledbetter has said his department has conducted witness interviews and coordinated with outside agencies, including the FBI, and has directly asked the public for eyewitness accounts of any arguments or disturbances on Horn Island that day. Here's why the FBI is involved at all, because that fact alone has fueled a lot of speculation that a federal criminal investigation is quietly underway. Horn Island sits on federal land, inside a national seashore, which routinely puts the FBI in a supporting role on cases like this one regardless of the circumstances of the death. Ledbetter himself has said this kind of coordination isn't unusual. As of this recording, the FBI's confirmed role is narrower than federal takeover. Agents have assisted with forensic examination of digital evidence, and separately, the FBI has opened its own investigation into threats made against witnesses and other individuals connected to the case, which is a real, distinct federal matter. Investigating threats of violence against people involved in a case is different from investigating the underlying death itself, and conflating the two overstates what's actually happening. By recent counts, investigators have interviewed roughly 60 witnesses while trying to piece together Nolan's final hours, a real scale of effort that doesn't always come through in coverage focused on any single piece of evidence at a time. At a July 14th press conference, Ledbetter described real, if incremental, progress. This recent week, we got a lot of valuable information that has come from the public. We put out a call to action last week for that information, and it has been very productive for us. He was direct about the case's status, too. This investigation is active. It's ongoing. On the toxicology question exactly, Ledbetter's office has noted that testing is handled by outside laboratories and that the review process routinely takes several weeks, consistent with what we told you earlier about primary and secondary panels. Sheriff Ledbetter has said the public can have confidence in the ongoing investigation. The Jackson County Sheriff's Department has said there is no evidence of foul play so far and has floated accidental drowning as the working theory, while stating the investigation remains open. This case has also become a genuine flashpoint in Mississippi politics, and it deserves honest naming because it shapes how the investigation is being perceived even when it doesn't change the underlying facts. Mississippi Governor Tate Reeves has publicly accused Ben Crump and Reverend Al Sharpton of stoking division around the case, without, as far as our research turned up, providing specific evidence to support that characterization. His exact words, given in a statement to Fox News Digital: Ben Crump and Al Sharpton are to blame for the threats. They're stoking division for personal gain. It's sad to see, but not unexpected. This is how they've built their careers. That's a sitting governor directly attributing threats of violence to two civil rights advocates' personal financial motives, in print on the record, a serious accusation in its own right, made without, in the reporting we reviewed, any specific evidence cited alongside it. Reeves wasn't alone in that response. After NAACP President Derrick Johnson's derelict in their duties comment, Mississippi State Senator Jeremy England and 4th District Congressman Mike Ezell both pushed back directly and publicly, defending Sheriff Ledbetter and the district attorney's integrity and arguing the investigation was prioritizing getting the facts right over responding to outside pressure, political or otherwise. That's a genuine two-sided public fight now playing out between state and local Mississippi officials on one side and national civil rights leadership on the other, with the actual facts of Nolan Wells' death sitting somewhere underneath both sets of talking points, still unresolved regardless of who wins the argument about tone. That's a real, on-record political statement from a sitting governor, and it's worth including for the same reason we included the race hustlers' framing from conservative commentary earlier, because how state leadership publicly frames this case shapes public trust in the investigation just as much as any autopsy finding does. And pretending state politics aren't part of the story would leave out something genuinely load-bearing. District Attorney Angel Myers-McElrath has confirmed the case will go before a Jackson County grand jury once the Sheriff's Department investigation is complete, and that the state autopsy materials will stay sealed until that grand jury reviews them. Let's pause to actually explain what a grand jury does, since the phrase gets thrown around in this case, as though everyone already understands it. A grand jury is not a trial. There's no defense attorney cross-examining witnesses, no judge ruling on evidence the way you'd see in the courtroom dramas that shape most people's mental image of a jury. A prosecutor presents evidence privately. The proceedings are sealed, and the grand jury's only job is to decide whether there's probable cause, a meaningfully lower bar than the beyond a reasonable doubt standard required for an actual conviction, to formally charge someone with a crime. In Mississippi, as in most states, the prosecutor controls almost entirely what the grand jury sees and hears, which is precisely why the sealing of Nolan Wells' autopsy until that proceeding is, procedurally, unremarkable. Grand jury materials are supposed to stay confidential by design, not as a special accommodation for this case. District Attorney McElrath's office has said this directly, in terms that deserve quoting specifically rather than paraphrasing. Every death in the county, except those of natural causes and non-criminal car wrecks, is presented to your grand jury. Her office has also stated plainly that convening a grand jury does not, by itself, mean anyone believes a crime occurred. It's the standard procedural path for any unnatural or otherwise unexplained death in the county, not a special escalation reserved for cases that look suspicious. That's an important corrective to how it's going to a grand jury tends to get read online, as though the step itself were already a signal of wrongdoing. It isn't. It's just what happens next, for this death specifically as it would for almost any other unnatural one in Jackson County. That is, again, a standard sequence for how these cases move through the Mississippi system. It is not, by itself, evidence of a cover-up, and we'd be doing exactly what we accuse other channels of doing if we told you it was. What we can tell you is that as of early August, more than a month after Nolan Wells died, there is no public timeline for when the sheriff's investigation concludes, no public autopsy, and no grand jury date. That gap, not any single piece of audio or tissue, is what Ben Crump's team has repeatedly pointed to as evidence that the pace of this investigation does not match its stakes. Let's talk about who's actually saying that and what it's built on, because a lawyer's advocacy for his own client is not the same thing as independent proof, and we'd rather you hear that distinction from us than assume we're not making it. Let's stack Crump's own credentials here rather than assuming you already know them, because his track record is doing real work in why this case escalated as fast as it did. Crump earned his law degree from Florida State University in 1995, has served as president of the National Bar Association, and currently serves as president of the National Civil Rights Trial Lawyers Association. He represented Trayvon Martin's family, Michael Brown's family after Ferguson, Breonna Taylor's family, and George Floyd's family, among many others, and negotiated settlements that include $27 million for the Floyd family and $12 million for the Taylor family. He's been nicknamed, only somewhat informally at this point, Black America's Attorney General. None of that makes his read on this specific, still open case correct. A lawyer's win record on other cases isn't forensic evidence in this one, but it does explain why his involvement alone functions as a national siren the moment he takes a case, independent of what the underlying facts turn out to be. That's important to understand as its own mechanism, separate from whether he's right about Nolan Wells. Crump has publicly challenged the accidental drowning theory on the grounds that Nolan Wells was a trained athlete and, by family accounts, a strong swimmer. That's a real argument and worth taking seriously, but it's also worth remembering that strong swimmers drown every year, from exhaustion, from currents, from head injuries sustained before entering the water, from 100 causes that have nothing to do with skill. Being good at something does not make you immune to it going wrong. Crump has also pointed to the retained throat tissue, the deleted messages, and the delay in producing the phone as, in his words, things that don't add up. Those are fair questions to raise publicly. They are not, on their own, proof of a specific alternate account of what happened on that island. We're stating that plainly because a channel that only platforms one side's framing isn't doing verification, it's doing advocacy with extra steps, and that's not what the series is for. And if we're going to hold Ben Crump's advocacy to that standard, fairness means we hold the other side to the exact same one. So let's look directly at what Warren Hudson's side of this case has actually said in its own defense, on the record, rather than letting it exist only as the silent thing this series keeps noting the absence of. Warren Hudson's father, Benjamin Hudson, has publicly released audio of what he describes as threats received by his family since the case went national, and launched a fundraising campaign on the platform Give Sengo that has, as of this recording, raised roughly $125,000. In their own public framing of that fundraiser, the young men and their families have precisely cited what they call race baiting as the source of the threats they say they've received, language that deserves plain notice, since it's the same charged framing that gets thrown at Crump and Sharpton from the other direction in this case, each side accusing the other of manufacturing racial grievance for its own benefit. In his own words on that fundraiser, the goal is, quote, drawing a line against defamation, targeted harassment, threats of violence, doxing, intimidation, and coordinated campaigns that destroy lives before the facts are known. The fund's stated purposes are twofold: to defend against potential wrongful death litigation the family anticipates from Crump's team, and to fund a defamation lawsuit against, in Hudson's framing, the influencers, outlets, and what he calls local provocateurs he believes have spread false claims. 3 young men have now retained defense counsel by name: Warren Hudson, Jack Spatalo, and Morgan Seymour. Their attorneys, J. Tyler Cox and defamation lawyer Edward Andrew Paltzik, issued a joint statement saying they are, quote, proud to stand with and fight for 3 completely innocent young men, and that those spreading what they characterize as lies about, in their words, these good Ocean Springs people will be held accountable to the maximum extent of the law. Warren Hudson, Jack Spatalo, and Morgan Seymour aren't the only young men who've had to lawyer up over online accusations connected to this case, either, and the newest name in that group was never even on the boat. Bart Edmiston Jr., a punter at the University of Wyoming and a former Ocean Springs high school teammate of Nolan's, retained Mississippi attorney Russell Attino after online speculation connected him to Nolan's death despite, as far as any public reporting shows, no evidence placing him on Horn Island that day at all. Latino's letter, sent to a New Orleans-based rapper, influencer, and OnlyFans model named Kim Brawley, alleges she falsely claimed Edmiston helped cause Nolan's death and took part in a cover-up, and more seriously, that she published his home address, photos of his house, his property records, and details about where his family members work. That's not a disagreement over interpretation of ambiguous evidence. If accurate, that's doxing a young man with no established connection to the case at all, over accusations with no public evidentiary basis, serious enough that Latino has said he intends to serve additional cease and desist letters to others making similar claims. It's the clearest single example in this entire case of the parasocial harm mechanism we described earlier actually landing on someone who, by every account we could find, wasn't even there. It's worth explaining specifically how Edmiston ended up in the story at all, because the origin is almost a case study in how this kind of speculation actually spreads. Some social media users claimed they could hear the name Bart in background chatter on that same CTO distress call we spent so much time on earlier in this update. The same recording a retired FBI agent said contained nothing nefarious. Separately, an old high school photo began circulating that appeared to show Edmiston with a young woman social media users identified as Katie McCormick. Latino has confirmed the photo does show a young Edmiston with a woman, but says it isn't McCormick at all, that Edmiston never dated her and, according to Latino, didn't know her before Nolan's death. In other words, a disputed word in a recording nobody can definitively parse, plus a misidentified photo of someone else entirely, became the entire evidentiary basis for branding a college football player at a different school in a different state as one of 3 named suspects in a death he has no established connection to. Latino's own words, posted July 29th, capture how fast that escalated. Bart received a credible death threat yesterday because of some of the made-up speculation on this and other sites. The FBI, state, and local law enforcement have all been activated. Latino's cease and desist letter to Lee exactly alleged she'd called Edmiston, one of 3 suspects implicated in the death of Mr. Wells, implied he'd engaged in specific conduct that caused or contributed to Mr. Wells' death, and implied he'd concealed information or otherwise acted inconsistently with innocence. He gave her 5 business days to make the relevant posts private, stop publishing Edmiston's personal information, and issue a public correction acknowledging she had no factual basis for any of it. Lee's response, for what it's worth, was not an apology. She responded publicly and defiantly, essentially daring Edmiston to actually file suit, saying she had attorneys lined up to take her case for free and that she had, in her own framing, nothing left to lose. Whether that posture survives an actual filed lawsuit, as opposed to a cease and desist letter, is a very different question, but as of this recording, it hasn't been tested because no lawsuit has been confirmed as filed yet, only threatened. One additional detail deserves plain statement rather than letting it imply more than it should on its own. TMZ has reported that the young men's legal team includes an attorney who has previously represented Donald Trump. We're including that because it's a real, sourced fact about who is representing them, not because legal representation implies anything about guilt or innocence in either direction. Lawyers represent clients. That's the job. Since federal law has come up twice now, let's do what almost no commentary on this case has bothered to do, and actually explaining what federal hate crimes law does and doesn't require, because you'll see wildly inflated claims about it circulating in comment sections under nearly every video about this case. The relevant federal statute is the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act, signed into law in 2009. It makes it a federal crime to willfully cause bodily injury to someone because of their actual or perceived race, among other protected categories, provided the crime falls within federal jurisdiction, which, notably, Horn Island's status as federal land would satisfy. But because of race is not a technicality prosecutors can infer from circumstance alone. It is an actual element of the crime that has to be proven, meaning prosecutors would need real evidence, a statement, a documented pattern, something concrete, that racial animus precisely motivated the act, not simply that the victim was black and the people around him were white. As of this recording, no evidence establishing that specific element has been made public in the Wells case, and no state or federal charges of any kind have been filed against anyone. That doesn't mean race has played no role in how this case has unfolded. The disparate community response, the media coverage research we cited earlier, the reward fund disparity, All of that is real and separate from the specific legal question of whether a hate crime, in the federal statutory sense, occurred. Those are two different conversations, and collapsing them into one, the way a lot of commentary on this case does, doesn't serve anyone trying to actually understand either one. It's worth looking at what that kind of proof actually looked like in a case that succeeded, because it makes the evidentiary gap in the Wells case concrete rather than abstract. Ben Crump also represented the family of Ahmaud Arbery, murdered while jogging in Georgia in 2020, and the men who killed him were federally convicted of hate crimes in 2022, convictions and appeals court upheld as recently as November 2025. What actually won that case wasn't the fact that Arbery was black and his killers were white. Federal prosecutors introduced specific, documented evidence of racial animus, prior racial slurs, bigoted messages, and social media posts from the defendants that a jury found showed what the appellate opinion called long-standing prejudice, sufficient for a reasonable juror to conclude race was the determinative factor in the killing. That's what a successful federal hate crime prosecution is actually built on. Not the racial composition of who is present, but affirmative, documented evidence of motive. Nothing resembling that kind of evidence has been made public in the Wells case, as of this recording. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist somewhere in the digital records currently under subpoena. It means nobody covering this case, including Crump himself in his public statements, has presented anything close to an Arbery-level evidentiary basis for a hate crime charge yet, and the distance between this case has racial dimensions worth examining, and this meets the federal bar for a hate crime is exactly the distance the Arbery case's actual evidence had to close. It's worth explaining specifically why a wrongful death lawsuit is the specific legal threat Benjamin Hudson's fundraiser is bracing for, because it's a genuinely different mechanism than the criminal process this entire update has otherwise focused on, and understanding the difference tells you why both tracks can move independently of each other. A criminal case requires the state to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, the standard we already walked through with the grand jury. A civil wrongful death suit requires only a preponderance of the evidence, meaning the family's attorneys would need to show it's simply more likely than not, essentially anything over a 50% probability, that a specific person's actions caused Nolan Wells's death. That's a dramatically lower bar, and it's also a track that doesn't require any criminal charges to exist first, or even to ever be filed. The clearest illustration most people already know is O.J. Simpson, acquitted of murder in criminal court, where the reasonable doubt standard wasn't met, and then found liable for wrongful death in a civil court, where the preponderance standard was. That's the exact fork Warren Hudson, Jack Spatalo, and Morgan Seymour's attorneys are getting ahead of, not just the possibility of an arrest, but the entirely separate possibility that a civil jury could reach a different conclusion on a lower bar, even if the criminal process reaches no charges at all. Here is the honest tension sitting underneath all of that, and we're not going to resolve it for you, because it can't be resolved by anyone except the grand jury. Everything Benjamin Hudson describes, coordinated harassment, doxing, threats of violence against people who have not been charged with any crime, would be genuinely wrong if it's happening the way he describes it, exactly as genuinely wrong as the hate mail sent to Christine Wansley. Being the family of someone who hasn't been charged does not strip you of the right to not receive death threats. At the same time, we are being harassed and we did nothing wrong are two separate claims, and only one of them is a factual question a grand jury can eventually settle. 3 named young men have not been charged with any crime connected to Nolan Wells's death, as of this recording. That is a fact this series is obligated to say as clearly as we say every other fact in this script, and it doesn't get softer just because the emotional gravity of the story pulls in the other direction. This is precisely the point in a case like this where history has something specific and uncomfortable to teach, and it deserves 2 real examples instead of a vague warning. In 1996, Richard Jewell, a security guard working the Atlanta Olympics, discovered a bomb, helped evacuate the area, and likely saved lives, and within days, after his name was leaked to reporters as a person of investigative interest, national coverage spent months treating him as the presumed bomber. He was later conclusively cleared. The actual bomber, Eric Rudolph, was identified years afterward. In 2006, a stripper's accusation against 3 Duke University lacrosse players triggered a prosecution built on almost no physical evidence, amplified nationally before the facts were established, and the case collapsed entirely. The accuser herself admitted decades later that she had fabricated it. Both cases are frequently taught together in journalism ethics courses for specifically one reason. The actual lesson isn't the accused are always innocent. Plenty of people who get investigated are, in fact, guilty. It's that public certainty formed before an investigation concludes has, in documented, real cases, been catastrophically wrong in both directions. And once it hardens into headlines and hate mail and reward money, it is very difficult to walk back even after the facts arrive. We're naming that history in the middle of an active case, involving real named 18 to 20-year-olds who have not been charged with anything on purpose, because it's the single sharpest argument for the confirmed versus alleged discipline this entire series is built on. It is possible, at the exact same time, for Christine Wansley to be owed real, urgent answers about her son, and for Warren Hudson, Jack Spatalo, and Morgan Seymour to be owed the presumption of innocence the American legal system promises everyone until a grand jury or a trial says otherwise. Those two obligations do not cancel each other out, and a series that only honors one of them isn't pursuing truth, it's just picking a side and calling it journalism. Now widen the frame, because this is where tonight's update connects Nolan Wells to two other cases for the first time on this channel, and we want to be upfront about why we're doing that and why it's not the kind of lazy, similar vibes comparison you'll see on other channels chasing the same traffic. These three cases share something more specific than a demographic pattern. They share an attorney. Ben Crump represents all three families, and this isn't a connection we're drawing on our own initiative. Crump himself has explicitly grouped these three cases together in public, most notably at the National Urban League Conference on July 30th, presenting Nolan Wells, Daniel Erving, and Tyler Smith as three 18-year-old black men who died within roughly 3 months of each other, each in the company of mostly white peers, each with a family still disputing or awaiting the official account of what happened. That's Crump's own framing of a pattern, stated publicly and repeatedly, which means tonight's comparison is following an argument that's already being made at a national podium, not inventing one from scratch. It matters that these aren't just three families being grouped together by an attorney's talking points, either. On that same day in Nashville, Christine and Elmore Wansley stood in person alongside Daniel Erving's family and Tyler Smith's family, together, having traveled to be in the same room. Crump's summary of where all three cases actually stand, stated plainly, nobody in all three of the questionable deaths of these 18-year-old young black kids, nobody has been held accountable in any way. As of this recording, 5 weeks after that Nashville gathering, that sentence is still accurate for all three cases. An indictment in Erving's case and a tampering charge in Smith's case are steps toward accountability for evidence handling, not accountability for anyone's death. And in at least two of the three, the actual documented forensic issue is not a mystery injury or a disputed autopsy finding. It's evidence that companions who were present admitted, on record, to getting rid of before police arrived. Start with Daniel Erving, because his case predates Nolan Wells's by nearly 3 months and gives you a real, adjudicated example of exactly the kind of behavior that's still unresolved in the Wells case. On April 13, 2026, 18-year-old Daniel Erving went to Lake Ray Hubbard near Rowlett, Texas, with 2 other young men, 19-year-old Lucas Roper and a second teenager whose name has been withheld because he was a minor at the time. According to the autopsy report, the 3 jumped from a railroad bridge into the lake. Erving surfaced once, called out for help, and went under. He did not resurface. His body was recovered 4 days later, on April 17th. Erving was an honor roll student and a member of his high school swim team, a detail his mother, Tamika Erving, has repeated publicly, for the same reason Ben Crump raises Nolan Wells's athleticism, because it complicates the easy assumption that a strong swimmer simply drowned. Here's the part of Erving's case that isn't ambiguous, isn't alleged, isn't waiting on a grand jury. Roper and the second teen did not call for help and wait. According to Dallas police, they left the scene, and in their own statements to investigators, admitted to throwing Erving's clothing into a tree and his cell phone out of a moving vehicle, and to deleting their text communications with him. Roper reportedly told police he did it because he panicked, knew there would be an active investigation, and, in his words, did not want to get in trouble. the actual timeline here matters, because the gap inside it is its own story. Erving's mother, Tamika Erving, filed a missing persons report with the Rowlett Police Department on April 14th, the day after the lake trip, when she couldn't reach her son. His body wasn't recovered until April 17th. Dallas police interviewed Lucas Roper on April 20th, voluntarily at his high school, and it was in that interview that Roper reportedly admitted to deleting the texts and calls and to directing the 17-year-old to throw Erving's phone from the vehicle. Read that sequence again. Police had Roper's confession on record by April 20th. The arrest warrant affidavit was not stamped until July 8th, and Roper was arrested July 9th, nearly 3 months after he admitted what he'd done. Both were arrested and charged with tampering with evidence, and Roper has since been formally indicted by a Dallas County grand jury on that same charge, meaning this case has already cleared the exact procedural step the Wells case is still waiting on. That's confirmed, an actual criminal charge, indicted by a grand jury, filed on the record, not a theory. One detail in the reporting deserves an honest flag rather than smoothing over. Some outlets described the second teen involved as 17 at the time, others as 16. We were not able to resolve that discrepancy against a single authoritative source, and we're naming the inconsistency itself rather than picking whichever number sounds more precise. Roper was released on a $10,000 bond shortly after his July 9th arrest, a genuinely small figure for a case that had, by that point, drawn national attention, and a concrete illustration of how a tampering charge, even in a high-profile case, is treated as a comparatively low-level offense by the bail system, regardless of the case's public profile. That 3-month gap between confession and arrest is precisely the kind of institutional slowness the Wells family, through Crump, has said they fear is now happening again in Jackson County, a case where the facts everyone needed were sitting in a file for months before anything moved. It's a fair worry to raise, and Erving's case did eventually move, on its own timeline, without the intervention of a grand jury the family had to demand. The state autopsy in Erving's case ultimately ruled the cause of death accidental drowning and reiterated that there were, quote, no current suspicions of foul play, even after the tampering charges were filed. Tamika Erving and the family, represented by Crump, are not accepting that as the end of the story. She said publicly, our family has gone through so much the past 3 months waiting for the justice system to provide justice, and the family has called for the 2 teens to face murder charges rather than the lesser tampering count. The charge itself, precisely stated, is tampering with or fabricating physical evidence with intent to impair, a third-degree felony under Texas law. The family's attorneys have put their actual demand in writing, and it deserves direct quotation rather than paraphrasing. Follow the facts where they may lead, and bring the appropriate charges, including but not limited to murder. That's not a vague call for justice. It's a specific instruction to prosecutors about the ceiling they want considered, not just the floor that's already been charged. The family has organized more than one fundraiser around the case since, one run by Daniel's sister, Mackenzie Erving, specifically earmarked for the cost of advocacy and public awareness efforts, flyers, and media outreach to keep the case visible, a distinct fundraising structure from the direct support model behind the Wells family's GoFundMe, its own way of keeping a case in public view once the initial news cycle fades. Sit with the shape of that case for a second, because it's the clearest example available anywhere in this trio of something Ben Crump has said explicitly about Nolan Wells, that people can panic, lie, destroy evidence, and still not be the person who caused a death. Roper admitted to disposing of evidence. He was charged for specifically that, and only that. The medical finding, accidental drowning, stood. That is what no foul play, but also not innocent conduct, looks like when a case actually resolves partway. It's a real precedent, and it cuts in a complicated direction. It shows that evidence tampering by scared teenagers is a documented, real pattern in cases like this, and it shows that tampering and causing a death are 2 different legal questions that don't automatically answer each other. Keep that split in mind, because Tyler Smith's case makes it even sharper. Subscribe to this channel now if that comparison changed how you're thinking about the Wells case, because we go deeper into exactly this kind of cross-case pattern analysis in every update, and we're not done. The third case is in some ways the most direct. Tyler Smith was 18 years old, a recent graduate of Lafayette High School in Lexington, Kentucky. He was shot and killed at a house party on Bluebonnet Drive in the early hours of July 4, 2026, the same holiday, the same year, a different state, a different circumstance entirely, and yet the same attorney now standing beside his family. Police were called to the scene at approximately 2:36 a.m., responding to a shooting reported in the 3800 block of Bluebonnet Drive. Smith died from what has been described as a gunshot wound to the head and facial area while attending a small gathering with 5 other young adults. The initial law enforcement characterization was that the shooting was likely self-inflicted, tied to an account that the group had been playing what was described as Russian roulette. Smith's family disputes that characterization outright. His grandmother, Nacy Anderson, and his uncle, Trayvon Petty, have said publicly that Smith showed no signs of depression or suicidal thinking, that he loved life, in Anderson's words, and that the self-inflicted account does not match the person they knew. Here is the confirmed forensic detail that makes this case genuinely difficult to wave away as grieving family members simply refusing to accept a hard truth. Shell casings recovered at the scene did not match the firearm that officers initially recovered. That's not a family claim. That's a ballistics finding. On July 10th, 20-year-old Bryce Chestnut was arrested and charged with tampering with physical evidence. Investigators determined the gun involved belonged to Chestnut, and he later admitted to removing his own firearm from the scene before police arrived. Witnesses have separately told police that Chestnut was carrying a different gun earlier that night than the one investigators ultimately recovered, and that he told Smith's uncle, Trayvon Petty, that the weapon wasn't loaded. 2 more specific, witness-sourced details that complicate the self-inflicted framing well beyond the ballistics mismatch alone. As of this recording, Chestnut is scheduled to appear in court on August 12th on the tampering charge. Nobody has been charged with causing Tyler Smith's death. Crump, representing the Smith family, has said the circumstances shock my conscience. A strong statement, and one we're presenting to you precisely as he made it, on the record, rather than softening or sharpening it to fit a narrative. The family has raised a separate, more basic grievance that has nothing to do with ballistics. They say they learned of Tyler's death, in their own words, through a private citizen rather than the authorities responsible for investigating the incident, which they say compounded our grief and created unnecessary confusion during one of the most devastating moments of our lives. Whatever eventually gets determined about how Tyler Smith died, a family finding out from a stranger before they heard from police is a separate, confirmed failure of process and deserves naming on its own rather than letting it get absorbed into the larger, unresolved question. A GoFundMe organized to cover funeral expenses described him as someone who worked at Kroger and Little Caesars and was, in the words of the organizer, the kind of young man every parent hopes their child will become. It raised $18,000 of its $20,000 goal within its first week. Family members remembered him as quiet and kind, the kind of person who made whoever he was with feel welcome, whether that was a coworker at Kroger or a lifelong friend. He'd recently enrolled at Bluegrass Community and Technical College to study robotics, and he was already running his own small hustle on the side. He told his grandmother, in what she's since repeated publicly, "This week I'm detailing cars. Next week I am cutting lawns, and the week after that, I am dismantling trees." He had just turned 18 that February. He died 5 months later, on the same holiday that took Nolan Wells' life 1,000 miles south. That's the third case laid out in full, and it deserves a pause before we pull these 3 stories together, because subscribe to this channel now if you want to make sure you catch our standalone deep dive updates on Daniel Erving's and Tyler Smith's cases specifically, not just the segments of them that fit inside a Nolan Wells episode. Both deserve, and are going to get, their own full-length treatment on this channel. Now put all 3 cases side by side, because this is the actual analytical spine of tonight's update, and it's a comparison built on documented fact, not vibes. In Nolan Wells' case, deleted messages and a delayed phone handoff remain unexplained. No one has been charged with anything. In Daniel Erving's case, 2 companions admitted to disposing of evidence and were charged with tampering. The death itself was still ruled accidental. In Tyler Smith's case, a ballistics mismatch and an admission of evidence removal produced a tampering charge against the gun's owner. No one has been charged with causing the death, and the family disputes the self-inflicted finding entirely. 3 different states. 3 different mechanisms of death: drowning, gunshot. 3 different sheriff's departments and 3 different state crime labs. And in every single one, the first instinct of the people physically present was not to preserve the scene, it was to get rid of something before anyone official arrived. That is the pattern this update is actually built on and deserves clear naming. It is not a pattern of proven murder. It is a documented, repeating pattern of consciousness of guilt about something, even when that something turns out to be panic and stupidity rather than the death itself, as the Erving autopsy suggests. Whether Nolan Wells's case ends up matching Erving's shape or Smith's shape or neither is exactly the open question the grand jury process exists to answer, and we don't have that answer yet. Nobody does. Let's actually put on a detective's hat for a minute and run this the way investigators are trained to, instead of the way true crime commentary usually does, because most coverage of this case skips straight to conclusions without ever laying out the framework a real investigation is built on. Detectives and prosecutors generally organize a case around 3 pillars: means, motive, and opportunity. Means is whether someone had the physical capability to do it. Motive is the why, and it's worth knowing legally that motive doesn't actually have to be proven for a conviction in most jurisdictions. It's means and opportunity that carry the real evidentiary weight, with motive functioning more as the thing that makes a jury believe the story, not the thing that legally requires proving. Opportunity is whether someone was actually there, physically capable of acting, in the relevant window. Run Nolan Wells's case through that framework honestly, using only what's confirmed tonight, and here's what you get. Opportunity, confirmed and essentially undisputed. Up to 30 people, by some accounts, were on or near that boat and that stretch of island in the hours before Nolan was last seen, meaning opportunity exists for a very large pool of people, which is precisely why Crump has pushed to treat all 3 boats and roughly 30 attendees as within the scope of the investigation rather than narrowing early to 1 boat. Means, essentially always present in a case like this. Multiple physically capable young adults in a low oversight setting is unfortunately means enough for any number of low-tech scenarios, from a fight that went wrong to simple negligence, and means alone narrows nothing here. Motive. This is the pillar that's actually empty in the public record. No specific, named, sourced motive, a prior conflict, a documented grudge, anything resembling what actually won the Arbery hate crime conviction, has been publicly established for anyone. That's the honest state of the triangle. Opportunity, wide open, means unhelpfully universal. Motive, currently blank. A responsible detective doesn't fill in that blank with speculation just because the story feels unsatisfying without it. A responsible detective keeps working the case until either a motive surfaces or the manner of death itself gets resolved as accidental, which would make the motive question moot entirely. That's not a dodge. That's what actually staying disciplined about an open case looks like from the inside, instead of from a comment section. If a real detective were asked to name the single highest value unanswered question in this entire case, the one piece of information that would do more to move this investigation than anything else on the table, it wouldn't be the tow call, and it wouldn't be the autopsy. It would be the material gap the Cajun Navy's own report already named. What actually happened, specifically between the last confirmed sighting of Nolan Wells and 4:31 p.m., when the boat left without him. Every other open question in this update, the phone, the deleted messages, the tide pattern, the discoloration, the audio, is downstream of that one window. Close that gap with a credible, corroborated account, and most of the rest of this case resolves itself almost automatically, whichever direction it resolves in. That's the actual investigative bottleneck, named plainly, and it's worth ending this section on that instead of on any of the more sensational individual details, because it's the one fact that would actually change everything else. Run that same triangle briefly across the other 2 cases, because the pattern holds, and it's instructive. In Daniel Erving's case, opportunity and means were never in question. 2 friends were physically present on that bridge, and the investigation didn't need to establish motive at all, because what actually got charged was the tampering, not the death itself. The state's own conclusion was accidental drowning, full stop. In Tyler Smith's case, opportunity narrows sharply to whoever was in that house between 2:26 and 3:30 in the morning, means sits entirely with whoever had access to a gun capable of firing the shot that killed him, and motive, specifically like in the Wells case, is publicly blank, Nobody has offered a credible reason anyone would have wanted to hurt Tyler Smith, which is part of why his family finds the self-inflicted ruling so hard to accept in the first place. 3 triangles, 3 different shapes, and in every single one the missing piece isn't means or opportunity. Plenty of people had both in all 3 cases. It's motive, sitting empty across the board, which is either the strongest argument that all 3 really were accidents, or the clearest sign that whatever actually happened in each case hasn't been found yet. Both readings are still alive tonight, and they'll stay alive until someone actually closes one of those 3 empty motive columns with real, named, sourced evidence instead of an audience's certainty. Occam's razor is the other piece of classic investigative reasoning worth applying honestly here, and it cuts in a direction a lot of viewers won't expect. The principle, credited to the medieval friar William of Occam, holds that absent a specific reason to believe otherwise, the explanation requiring the fewest new assumptions is usually the right one to test first. Not because it's always correct, but because it's the most efficient starting hypothesis, and efficient use of investigative resources matters in a real case, even when it doesn't matter to an audience. Applied here, that would mean testing the accidental drowning hypothesis first, rigorously, before reaching for a more complex alternative requiring a coordinated cover-up among as many as 30 teenagers. But, and this is the part good detective work also requires, per researchers who study investigative failures, Occam's razor becomes a liability the moment it gets used to justify stopping the investigation the second a simple story becomes available, rather than as a starting point to be tested and discarded if it doesn't hold up. That's precisely the criticism Crump has leveled at Sheriff Ledbetter's early no foul play suspected language. Not that accident was the wrong place to start, but that it was treated as a finish line before the actual testing, the retained tissue, the toxicology, the deleted messages, the tied analysis, was anywhere close to complete. The discipline isn't picking the simple story or the complicated one. It's refusing to stop testing until the evidence, not the convenience of an early conclusion, decides which one survives. There's a reason this pattern keeps happening, and it's worth a real explanation instead of just restating the coincidence. Forensic and legal researchers who study evidence tampering behavior in panicked, non-professional actors, as opposed to premeditated criminals, describe a fairly consistent psychological sequence. Shock, followed by an instinct to undo the scene rather than preserve it, followed by rationalization that destroying something is the same as making it not have happened. It is, in the language forensic psychologists use, a young and underdeveloped threat response, not typically evidence of premeditated intent, which is exactly why the legal system treats tampering and homicide as separate charges requiring separate proof. That's not us excusing what Lucas Roper or Bryce Chestnut did. It's us explaining why he tried to hide something and he caused the death are not automatically the same fact, however much they feel like they should be in the moment you hear about either one. Let's talk about the money for a second, because it tells you something real about how this case is being amplified, and it deserves the same scrutiny we've applied to everything else. The reward fund for information in Nolan Wells's case has grown in stages and currently stands at $175,000 as of this recording. Reverend Al Sharpton pledged $50,000 publicly during his eulogy at Wells's funeral. Filmmaker Tyler Perry matched that $50,000 and additionally paid for the funeral service itself. Retired NFL Hall of Famer Terrell Owens added $25,000 more, bringing the total to $125,000. Since then, the father of another teenager who was on Horn Island with Wells that day added a further $50,000 of his own, explicitly matching Sharpton's original pledge, pushing the confirmed total to $175,000. That's confirmed, sourced to multiple named outlets, not a rumor, and it deserves a second look. A parent connected to one of the teenagers present that day is now personally funding part of the reward for information about what happened, an action that reads as either genuine grief-driven solidarity or a notable gesture toward transparency from inside the friend group, depending on which parent it turns out to be and how you're inclined to read it. Here's a brief explanation of what a reward fund like this is actually built to do, because it's more mechanical than emotional. It exists to shift the incentive math for someone who already knows something, but is weighing the social cost of coming forward against 300 people who were on that island, and, by all accounts, a fairly tight-knit local community that doesn't want to turn on its own. A six-figure number is precisely sized to make that math flip for at least one person. Whether anyone has come forward with new, verifiable information because of that money has not been publicly reported as of this recording. That's an open loop too. That reward fund is worth separating clearly from a second, much larger sum of money connected to this case because the two get conflated constantly and they serve completely different purposes. Separate from the $175,000 reward for information, GoFundMe set up to directly support the Wells family has raised more than $750,000 toward an $850,000 goal, including a single $100,000 donation from Byron Allen, the media executive who owns the Weather Channel, who explained the gift simply. "My prayers are with this beautiful family during this very difficult time. My hope is that Nolan Wells' loved ones and humanity get all the answers that we deserve." According to the fundraiser's own stated purpose, that money is earmarked for costs tied to the ongoing investigation and any legal proceedings that follow, as well as to help the family, in the fundraiser's own words, treat and manage the mental and emotional anguish associated with Nolan's disappearance, his death, and all the unanswered questions and mystery surrounding his death. We're stating that stated purpose plainly and directly because it's the specific, factual rebuttal to the insinuation in that hate mail sent to Christine Wansley's house, the one implying she was profiting off her son's death. A publicly stated purpose isn't automatically the same as verified spending, and we tell you if we found evidence the money was being used some other way. We haven't found any. What we found is a public, itemized explanation for what nearly $1 million combined dollars is actually for, sitting right next to an anonymous accusation that offered no explanation for anything at all. Put that $175,000 next to a different number for a second, because the comparison is uncomfortable, and it's the kind of comparison this series exists to make with actual figures instead of a vague sense that coverage feels unequal. The combined reward in the ongoing disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, a missing persons case that has drawn sustained national coverage this year, currently sits above $1.2 million, a combination of a $1 million family-funded reward and an additional $50,000 FBI contribution, according to reporting from Fox News and the FBI's own public reward notice. Guthrie is white and is the mother of a television journalist, a detail researchers who study missing persons coverage say correlates across large datasets with dramatically more sustained attention and larger funding. That's not this series speculating. It's an actual, decades-old field of research. Journalist Gwen Ifill coined the term missing white woman syndrome back in 2004 to describe specifically this pattern, and it's been studied empirically since, not just repeated as a slogan. One frequently cited analysis found that white missing women and girls receive more initial news coverage and more repeated follow-up coverage than black missing women and girls with comparable case circumstances. Separate research has found that coverage of missing women of color more often frames the victim's own behavior as a risk factor, while coverage of missing white women more often centers her role as a daughter, a wife, a mother, the language of a life interrupted rather than a life that invited danger. We're citing that research directly by name because the coverage feels unequal is a much weaker claim than here's a peer-reviewed body of research measuring exactly how, and here's a live, dollar-for-dollar example sitting in the news at the same moment as this case. $1.2 million versus $175,000 is not proof of anything about either individual case. Nancy Guthrie's case has its own specific circumstances driving that number, including, per a retired FBI agent's public comments, an unusually small suspect pool. But it is a real, current, checkable data point in precisely the pattern Ifill named 22 years ago, and pretending that pattern doesn't exist would be its own kind of dishonesty. It's also worth naming, briefly and honestly, that this case has been claimed by opposite ends of the media ecosystem in ways that tell you more about the ecosystem than about Nolan Wells. On one end, some coverage, including at least one outlet that described the family's advocates in dismissive, loaded terms like race hustlers, has treated the entire case as manufactured grievance from the outset, before the independent autopsy, before the ballistics comparison to other cases, before any of the actual open forensic questions we've walked through tonight. On the other end, Some coverage has treated every unverified claim, including audio enhancements nobody has independently authenticated, as though it were already proven. Both of those approaches are doing the same thing with a different flag on it, deciding the ending first and mining the case for material that fits it. We named the specific limitations in Dr. Mitchell's report. We named the specific legal defense the Hudson family has mounted, and we named the specific research behind the reward disparity, because the alternative, picking a lane and staying in it, is not a harder version of this series, it's an easier one, and it's not the one we're making. Since we're already talking about how this case gets distorted on its way to an audience, let's spend a moment on the specific pieces of outright fabricated material that have circulated around it, because naming them clearly is a service the series can actually provide that raw reaction content can't. A photo circulated widely online, falsely presented as proof that Nolan was alive sometime after his disappearance. Debunked. A separate photo, actually taken on June 27th, more than a week before the 4th of July, was misattributed and passed around as though it were tied directly to the day he died, also debunked, and debunked with real specificity once you trace it. The photo shows Nolan at a pool party in Pass Christian, Mississippi, taken at 11:58 p.m. on June 27th, a full week before he ever set foot on Horn Island. Warren Hudson himself confirmed the timeline directly, saying he's the one standing next to Nolan in the photo, with his arm around his shoulders. That's a case where the correction actually came from inside the friend group being scrutinized, and giving credit for a correction is specifically as important as flagging a fabrication. Fairness runs in both directions, or it isn't fairness. A widely shared video was framed as showing a confrontation involving Nolan arguing to get his phone back. A friend named Tracyston Shepard, who appears in the clip, has publicly disputed that framing, saying plainly, "Those were not Nolan's words, they were mine." The confrontation in the video, in other words, wasn't the one the internet decided it was watching. The fuller story behind it is almost a case study in how a piece of misinformation gets built, brick by brick, from people acting in good faith. The person who originally filmed the video was on Horn Island that day and shot it to send to their spouse, a completely mundane piece of footage with no connection to Nolan at all when it was recorded. After Nolan went missing, that same person posted it publicly hoping someone could help identify people in it. Only after it went viral did strangers start claiming Nolan was one of the people fighting. According to Shepard, the actual disagreement in the video was his own. He says he was waist-deep in the water having an argument with his girlfriend when a stranger walked by, criticized them, and started an altercation with him, a dispute that had nothing to do with Nolan Wells at any point in its actual chain of events. And on August 1st, Mississippi Department of Public Safety Commissioner Sean Tyndall issued a public statement warning that a purported toxicology report for Nolan Wells circulating on social media is fraudulent, a fake document, manufactured and passed around as though it were real forensic evidence, months before any actual toxicology has been released. We're naming every one of those specifically because a viewer who's been following this case casually has almost certainly encountered at least one of them presented as fact, and because a series built on labeling every claim confirmed or alleged has an obligation to also say, clearly, when something isn't alleged at all, it's fabricated. There's one more piece of misinformation that deserves its own sentence, because it circles back directly to something we told you earlier in this update. Some corners of the internet, drawn by the shared surname, spread a claim that Nolan Wells was a descendant of Ida B. Wells, the same journalist and anti-lynching investigator we mentioned when we walked through the historical lineage Ben Crump has invoked in this case. Michelle Duster, a verified, on-record descendant of Ida B. Wells, has said plainly there is no historical or genealogical evidence connecting the two families. That correction doesn't weaken the point we made earlier about why Crump's invocation of Ida B. Wells's legacy resonates the way it does. That point was about a rhetorical and historical lineage, not a literal bloodline, and it stands on its own. But getting the shared name confused for a shared family is exactly the kind of detail that spreads fast precisely because it feels meaningful, and precisely the kind of detail this series exists to unspread the moment it turns out to be false. Before the funeral, though, it's worth pulling the frame back from evidence and procedure entirely for a moment, because it's possible to spend this much time on toe calls and tissue samples and lose track of who Nolan Wells actually was outside of being the subject of an investigation. He graduated Ocean Springs High School in 2025 as a multi-sport athlete, not a specialist, the kind of kid who shows up for more than one season, more than one team, more than one set of teammates and coaches who'd have a stake in how he's remembered. He went on to play wide receiver at Southwest Mississippi Community College, a position that, at that level, typically means grinding through a walk-on adjacent path rather than arriving with a scholarship handed to him, hours in a weight room and a film room most of his hometown never saw. He was 18, an age where you are legally an adult, and for most people, still functionally a kid figuring out who you're becoming, caught in that narrow window where you're old enough to be left on an island by your friends, and young enough that your mother still expects a call back the same night. That's the person underneath every acronym and every timestamp in this script, and deserves plain statement before we go back to the procedural machinery. Whatever the grand jury eventually finds, an 18-year-old who just finished one football season and was building toward another is not walking into the next one. His college coaches said as much, in specifics rather than platitudes, and specifics are what make grief legible instead of generic. Head coach Les George called the news heartbreaking and said what stuck with him wasn't Nolan's talent so much as his consistency, showing up to meetings on time, finishing every workout, doing the unglamorous parts of the job the same way every day. George remembered a game where Wells didn't get a single rep on the field and was still the most excited person on the sideline, celebrating everyone else's plays like they were his own. Wide receivers coach Erving described Wells as the most improved player on the offense that spring and recalled their last conversation in person, Wells stopping by his office near the end of the semester to talk about training over the summer, the two of them doing their usual handshake, and Wells telling him, before he left, that he loved him. Moore told him the same thing back. Teammate Sheroyd Whitehead called him one of his best friends and said he was the most respectful person I know. And in the receiver's room, during the team's weekly film sessions, the seat Wells used to occupy, to Moore's right, has stayed empty. Nobody's assigned it to anyone else. That's not a detail from a press release. That's a football team quietly deciding on their own that a chair stays open for someone who isn't coming back to sit in it. The funeral itself deserves a real accounting, not just a mention, because it's the point in this story where the case stopped being a regional headline and became something closer to a movement. Services were held July 20th at Centerpoint Church in Ocean Springs. Reverend Al Sharpton delivered the eulogy. Filmmaker Spike Lee and Terrell Owens were both in attendance. Warren Hudson's father, Benjamin Hudson, the same man behind the Give Send Go Defense Fund we'll get to shortly, has said he skipped Nolan's funeral entirely out of safety concerns after his family received threats. Whatever you make of the boat, the phone, or the tow call, a father staying away from a memorial service for his son's friend because he's afraid for his family's safety is its own small, specific measure of how far this case had already traveled by July 20th. Nolan's parents, Christine and Elmore Wansley, spoke. Before the funeral, the Wansleys had already broken their public silence in an interview with Michael Strahan on Good Morning America, with Crump seated beside them. Christine's words there were plain and almost entirely free of accusation. We just want honesty and transparency. We want a thorough investigation. We want that same respect that would be given to anybody else. And that's it. We just want answers. Elmore's contribution to that same interview was smaller and, in its own way, harder to hear afterward. We always told him, if you go with a group, you stay with a group. That's not a statement about race, or about foul play, or about any of the forensic questions this update has spent thousands of words on. It's the ordinary advice most parents give their kids before a holiday with friends, recalled by a father after it turned out, this one time, not to have been followed, whether by choice, as Warren Hudson maintains, or by something else entirely, which is precisely the question nobody has answered yet. Christine's words at the funeral itself on record. We thank you, Lord, for the beautiful 18 years that you blessed us with. Read that sentence again slowly and notice what it isn't. It isn't an accusation. It isn't a demand. It's a mother thanking God for the years she got, in public, 3 days before her son's independent autopsy would come back unable to tell her how those years ended. That juxtaction, gratitude next to unresolved grief, deserves sitting with because it's easy to lose the actual human being at the center of a case like this underneath grand juries and ballistics reports and reward totals, and Christine Wansley's own words at that funeral are the plainest reminder available that none of this is abstract to her. Elmore Wansley, Nolan's stepfather, has said something in his own public remarks that deserves to sit next to Crump's framing rather than underneath it, because it's a more complicated position than either race is definitely the cause, or race had nothing to do with this, and it came from inside the family rather than from an attorney speaking for them. Standing alongside Sharpton and Crump at a press conference, Wansley said, "Me and his dad had conversations with him all the time, not just about the importance of understanding our history as Black people, but also the importance of how you have to move in certain spaces." Pressed further on whether the family was reading race into an ambiguous situation, Wansley pushed back directly. "It's not us feeding into racism or the stereotypes that come with that. Unfortunately, it's just a matter of fact." That's not a claim that race caused Nolan's death. Wansley doesn't say that. It's a father describing the ordinary, exhausting calculus Black parents in Mississippi have had to teach their sons for generations, independent of what turns out to have happened on that specific afternoon on that specific island. Both things can be true at once. That calculus can be real and necessary, and the actual cause of Nolan Wells's death can still be an open, undetermined medical and legal question that this update has spent thousands of words trying not to prejudge. And it should trouble you, regardless of what you believe happened on that island, that this is also the point where Christine Wansley became a target. In the days before the funeral, she received hate mail at her home, a mailing that included a photo of Sharpton and Crump standing with her and her husband, defaced with arrows drawn from the two men toward Christine and dollar signs added beside them, implying she was being financially exploited by her own advocates while grieving her son. In the weeks after, her professional page, she works as a family medicine nurse practitioner, was targeted with a wave of one-star reviews, unrelated to her actual clinical work, timed to the case's press coverage. It escalated past reviews, too. In early August, the Mississippi Board of Nursing opened a formal professional misconduct investigation into Wansley after receiving an anonymous complaint. Crump called it an act of intimidation directly, noting that Wansley had practiced in Mississippi for years without a single complaint filed against her license, until, as he put it, she started asking questions about her son's death. The board's investigation has since been closed, with no misconduct finding against her. That's the actual arc of it. An anonymous stranger tried to use a state licensing board to threaten a grieving mother's livelihood, and the state's own review found nothing to substantiate it. There is no version of this story, no matter which side of the drowning versus foul play question you land on, where sending a grieving mother hate mail before her son's funeral is a defensible act. We're stating that as plainly as we stated the limits of Dr. Mitchell's autopsy, because a series built on fairness has to be willing to call an unambiguous wrong exactly what it is, even when it doesn't require any hedging at all. If this update has been useful to you, if the confirmed versus alleged breakdown actually helped you understand what's real in this case instead of just making you angrier about it, tell us in the comments which of the 3 cases you think is most likely to actually resolve first. We read every one of them, and we follow up on the ones that hold up. Ben Crump has, in public remarks about this case, repeatedly invoked a specific lineage of names: Thurgood Marshall, Martin Luther King Jr., Medgar Evers, Fannie Lou Hamer, Ida B. Wells. He's framed the backlash he and Nolan's family have received, the accusations of race baiting, the hate mail directed at Christine Wansley, as continuous with the backlash those figures faced in their own lifetimes. That's a real rhetorical choice that deserves examining on its own terms rather than either accepting or dismissing wholesale. Ida B. Wells, precisely, spent much of her career documenting lynchings in Mississippi with the same basic method the series is trying to apply on a much smaller scale. Verify the claim, name the source, publish what can be proven, and say plainly what can't be. She was attacked for it. Her printing press in Memphis was destroyed by a mob in 1892, and the documentation she produced anyway is still the historical record scholars rely on today. Invoking that lineage doesn't settle whether Nolan Wells died by accident or violence. Those are 2 entirely separate questions, one historical and rhetorical, One forensic and factual, but it does explain something real about why this case, and Crump's handling of it, resonates the way it has with a national audience far beyond Ocean Springs, Mississippi. It's worth being specific about that Mississippi history rather than gesturing at it, because the actual documented record is more concrete and more disturbing than a vague reference to the past. In August 1955, 14-year-old Emmett Till was kidnapped, beaten, shot, and thrown into the Tallahatchie River in Money, Mississippi, after being accused of whistling at a white woman in a store. The two men tried for his murder were acquitted by an all-white, all-male jury within about an hour of deliberation, and one of them later confessed to a magazine reporter after Double Jeopardy protected him from ever facing charges again. In June 1964, 3 civil rights workers, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, were murdered by Klan members with the participation of a sitting deputy sheriff in Neshoba County, Mississippi, while investigating the burning of a black church that had hosted a Freedom Summer voter registration school. It took federal civil rights charges, not state murder charges, to convict anyone at all in 1967, and it took until 2005, 41 years later, for a single participant, Edgar Ray Killen, to be convicted at the state level on manslaughter rather than murder. Both cases are federally documented, not disputed history. The FBI and the Justice Department's own Civil Rights Division maintain public case files on both. That specific, sourced record, not a generalized sense of regional guilt, is what sits underneath every time this case gets described as unfolding against Mississippi's fraught history, a phrase used often enough in coverage of this case that it matters to know precisely what it's shorthand for. There's also a documented reason cases like this one grip an audience and hold it for weeks the way this one has, and it deserves explaining rather than just describing, because understanding the mechanism doesn't make the grip any less real. Psychologists call it the Zeigarnik effect, the well-documented finding, first observed by Soviet psychologist Bluma Zeigarnik in the 1920s, that unfinished tasks and unresolved narratives occupy far more mental space than completed ones. An open case is structurally an open loop, and human attention is built to keep returning to open loops until they close. That's not a criticism of anyone following this story closely. It's the actual cognitive reason a genuinely unresolved case like this one, with real stakes for a real family, is capable of holding a viewer's attention across a 40-minute video in a way a tidy, solved case simply can't. It's also, and this deserves honest naming, the same mechanism a bad faith channel can exploit by manufacturing false open loops instead of reporting real ones, which is specifically why we draw the line we draw between confirmed and alleged as hard as we do, every single time, even when the alleged version is more satisfying. There's a second, related mechanism worth naming, because it explains why a viewer following this case can end up feeling like they personally know Christine Wansley, or Warren Hudson, or Ben Crump, despite never having met any of them. Communication researchers call it parasocial interaction, a one-sided psychological bond an audience forms with a public figure or a recurring media narrative through repeated exposure, one that the brain processes with some of the same social machinery it uses for real relationships. Recent research into true crime audiences exactly has found that platforms which make it easy to comment, share, and check back frequently tend to deepen that bond into something closer to compulsive engagement, and that the one-sidedness of it, you know a great deal about these people, they know nothing about you, can intensify emotional reactions rather than moderate them. That's not a criticism of caring about this case. It's an explanation for why it can start to feel unusually personal, why a stranger might feel licensed to mail hate to Christine Wansley's house or harass 3 teenagers who haven't been charged with anything, as though ordinary social restraint doesn't apply, because the relationship on the audience's end doesn't feel like it's with strangers at all. Understanding that mechanism doesn't excuse either kind of behavior. It just explains why an update like this one can generate a level of feeling that a case with these exact same facts, covered without names or faces, or 5 weeks of accumulated familiarity, simply wouldn't. There's a third mechanism worth naming, and it's the one that arguably matters most for how you should be watching this specific update, not just this case in general. Psychological research on confirmation bias, including studies precisely on legal experts and criminal investigators, not just casual observers, has found something uncomfortable. When evidence is genuinely ambiguous, people don't evaluate it neutrally. They interpret it in whatever direction already matches what they walked in believing. One well-documented study found that police officers' initial gut read on a suspect's guilt or innocence in a fictional case directly predicted how they evaluated ambiguous evidence presented afterward, which in turn predicted their final verdict. The ambiguous evidence didn't determine the conclusion, the starting assumption did, and the evidence just got absorbed into confirming it either way. That finding wasn't about biased people trying to cheat. It was about how ordinary cognition works under uncertainty, and it applies specifically as much to a viewer watching this case from their phone as it does to a trained investigator. If you came into this update already believing Nolan Wells was murdered, the tow call's silence about him probably read as damning. If you came in believing it was a tragic accident, that same silence probably read as unremarkable. Neither reaction makes you wrong or biased in some unusual way. It makes you human, working with the exact same ambiguous evidence everyone else has, including us. The only real defense against it on either side is the discipline of forcing yourself to state plainly what's actually confirmed before deciding what it means, which is the entire structural premise this series has been built on from its very first episode. It's important to connect that directly back to the means-motive opportunity framework we walked through earlier, because the two mechanisms compound each other in a way that should make you more careful, not less. The same research on confirmation bias in criminal investigators found that once a detective forms an early belief about guilt or innocence, they don't just interpret ambiguous evidence to fit it, they tend to search harder for evidence in whichever pillar, motive especially, would confirm what they already suspect, rather than searching evenly across means, motive, and opportunity the way the framework is actually designed to be used. That's precisely why the empty motive column in Nolan Wells's case matters so much, and why it should stay empty in your own head rather than getting quietly filled in with whichever theory you found most persuasive going in. Let's return to that tow call one more time because we told you at the start we'd come back to it, and this is where it actually belongs in the larger picture instead of standing alone as a suspicious data point. A boat is sinking, or reported as sinking. Nobody on that call mentions a missing friend. Now hold that next to Daniel Erving's case, where the two teens who were with him didn't call for help and wait for police at all. They left and disposed of evidence, and only came forward, by their own admission, because they knew an investigation was already underway and panicked about getting caught. Hold it next to Tyler Smith's case, where the gun owner removed his own firearm from an active crime scene before officers arrived. In two of these three cases, we now know, confirmed and charged, that the people present chose concealment as their first instinct. In the Wells case, nobody has been charged with anything, and the tow call itself, per the retired FBI agent's public assessment, doesn't show anything nefarious on its face. So, which pattern does the Wells case actually belong to? The Erving pattern, where tampering happened but the death itself was still accidental, or something closer to Smith's, where the tampering charge is real but the actual cause of death remains an open, disputed question? We genuinely don't know yet. Neither does the grand jury that hasn't been convened. That is not us dodging the question. That is the honest state of the evidence as of the second week of August 2026, and pretending otherwise for the sake of a cleaner story would be a betrayal of exactly the standard we open this update with. There's a detail in the most recent CNN reporting on this case, published August 8th, that complicates the framing you'll hear in almost every other video about this case, including some of our own earlier language tonight, and fairness means correcting it in real time rather than letting it stand uncorrected until a future update. This case is consistently described as Nolan Wells being the only black teenager in the friend group on that boat. According to that CNN reporting, there was actually another black teenager who was supposed to be on that same boat and didn't end up aboard because it filled up before he could get on. We don't yet know that friend's account of what he saw or heard before the boat left, and as of this recording we haven't seen him quoted directly with any independent knowledge of what happened on the water. But the existence of a second black teenager in the friend group, left off the boat by circumstance rather than absent from the friend group entirely, is a real, reported fact that complicates the sole black teen among an all-white group framing this case has been built on from day one. And we'd be doing precisely what we've spent this entire update accusing other coverage of doing if we kept repeating that framing after finding a report that complicates it. The most immediate of the moment development in this case happened 2 days ago. On the afternoon of August 7th, Warren Hudson and Jax Patalo returned to Horn Island directly, accompanied by their attorney's account of the visit rather than by investigators. According to a joint statement from attorneys Edward Andrew Paltzik and J. Tyler Cox given to CNN, the two spent roughly 3 hours on the island, and the stated purpose was not to collect evidence, but to understand what their statement called the island's layout and dynamics, walking the actual physical space where their friend was last seen. Their attorneys described it as a very emotional afternoon for Warren and Jax. There's a fact about Warren Hudson's own family that deserves careful, specific treatment rather than either silence or insinuation, because it's independently corroborated, and it's precisely the kind of proximity to power detail that matters in a small county case like this one. Warren Hudson's mother, Ashley Cole, is a sitting judge in Jackson County, the same county where this entire investigation and any eventual grand jury proceeding is taking place. We want to be precise about what that fact does and doesn't mean. We found no evidence that Judge Cole has any official role in this specific investigation, no evidence of any procedural irregularity tied to her position, and no credible, independently sourced confirmation of the various viral claims circulating about her office and the case's tip line. Those claims exist only in social media posts we could not verify against any established outlet, and we're not repeating their specifics here, for specifically that reason. What is separately confirmed and serious in its own right is that a man from Sacramento, California, was arrested on July 30th after being indicted by a federal grand jury on a felony count for sending threatening messages to Cole over Facebook connected to this case. That a sitting local judge's family became the target of a chargeable federal threat over a case her son is connected to tells you something real about how far this story has traveled from a missing 18-year-old on a barrier island. And having a parent who's a judge in the very county handling your case is a fact that would raise reasonable conflict of interest questions in any small jurisdiction, independent of whether anything improper has actually occurred. We haven't found evidence that it has. Since we last checked, Judge Cole has actually addressed this on the record herself, and fairness means giving you her own words rather than leaving her only as the subject of other people's speculation. She's confirmed publicly that she is a judge, shared a timeline of events she said was meant to dispel some rumors with facts, and explained that she had temporarily deactivated her Facebook account, writing, "Yes, I am a judge. I also value transparency. I apologize if anyone was offended that I deleted my social media. There were no nefarious motivations in my deleting my social media." She's also shared screenshots showing dozens of threatening messages sent to her family and announced her family would not be speaking further to media while the investigation remains active. One detail in the reporting deserves a flag rather than smoothing over, consistent with how we've handled every other discrepancy tonight. Some outlets described the friend connected to Judge Cole as her son, others as her stepson, and we were not able to resolve which is accurate against a single authoritative source. Separately, a Change.org petition has circulated calling for Cole's removal from the bench over alleged judicial ethics violations connected to this case. A petition is public pressure, not a finding of any kind. Mississippi's actual judicial conduct process, not an online petition, is what would ever formally evaluate an ethics claim against a sitting judge, and we found no evidence any formal ethics complaint has actually been filed or evaluated by the body that would handle one. Morgan Seymour, the third friend represented by the same legal team, was not reported as part of that specific visit. We're presenting that plainly, without reading motive into it one way or the other. A voluntary, attorney-accompanied, non-evidentiary visit to the site is consistent both with genuine grief and with the defense team managing its client's public presentation, and those two things are not mutually exclusive. That same CNN reporting contains the most concrete confirmation yet of how far the harassment on both sides of this case has actually gone, and it deserves to be stated in plain numbers rather than vague reference to threats. Some of Wells's friends, along with local officials connected to the case, have said they received threats against their lives. Separately, threats connected to this case were serious enough that 3 people have been criminally charged, individuals from Illinois, Ohio, and California, according to that reporting, with no apparent personal connection to any of the families involved in Mississippi. Strangers, in other words, radicalized enough by watching this case from a distance to commit an actual chargeable crime over it. All three have now been named in reporting with real specificity. Edward James Porter, of Berwyn, Illinois, is accused of making multiple threatening calls and texts on July 31st alone, threatening to kill 2 witnesses and their families and separately threatening to kill police officers in the same string of communications. In one of those calls, according to court documents, telling a person in Mississippi he would cut them up and put them in a suitcase, not vague online hostility, but specific, named, prosecutable death threats against both private citizens and law enforcement connected to this case. Michelle Francine Edwards, of the Cincinnati, Ohio area, is accused of calling in bomb threats on July 23rd to both the George County Chancery Clerk's Office and the Jackson County Sheriff's Office, meaning actual government buildings had to treat this case-adjacent harassment as a credible explosive threat, with whatever evacuation and response that requires. And Joseph Alfredo Vasquez Dumars, of Sacramento, California, was federally charged exactly with threatening to kill Jackson County Chancery Court Judge Ashley Cole, Warren Hudson's own mother, after sending threatening Facebook messages on July 11th, and this is now confirmed by top-tier reporting rather than resting on social media claims alone, with The Washington Post directly headlining its own coverage. 3 people charged with threatening judge, witnesses in Nolan Wells' case. That's a meaningfully stronger level of sourcing than what we were able to verify earlier about the tip line rumor, and you deserve an update on that basis. A sitting judge connected to this case was, in fact, a confirmed target of a federal threats charge, reported by one of the most rigorously fact-checked outlets in the country, even though the specific tip line claim about her office remains unverified and excluded from this update for the reasons we gave earlier. Ben Crump, in that same CNN piece, put the family's position plainly. The family has distrust of the Mississippi law enforcement officials giving them a fair investigation where their black son ended up dead after going out on a boat with 3 young white men. That's Crump's characterization of his own client's state of mind, stated as precisely that, not as a neutral finding, and it sits, uncomfortably and honestly, right next to the confirmed fact that 3 total strangers with no connection to Mississippi have already been charged with crimes for how they acted out their own certainty about this same case from somewhere else in the country entirely. Here's the part of that dynamic that should concern you regardless of which version of this case you believe, because it's not really about Nolan Wells specifically. It's about what online outrage actually does to a case like this one mechanically, whether or not that's anyone's intention. Scholars who study internet vigilantism have documented this exact outcome as predictable, not surprising. Harassment campaigns built around a contested criminal case routinely obstruct the very investigations they claim to be demanding by driving away or intimidating the witnesses, officials, and family members whose cooperation is actually required to produce any real result. Threatening a judge doesn't speed up a grand jury. Bomb-threatening a sheriff's office doesn't produce a faster toxicology report. Doxing a college punter with no connection to the case doesn't recover a single deleted Snapchat message. Every one of those actions, from strangers who have never met anyone involved, makes the actual goal, answers for Nolan Wells' family, measurably harder to reach, not easier. If you actually want this case resolved, the people best positioned to help are the ones closest to it. Witnesses willing to come forward, officials willing to work the case without fear, and a public willing to apply pressure without applying threats. Everyone else, no matter how certain they feel watching from somewhere else in the country, is functionally working against the outcome they claim to want. Put yourself in the actual seat that's eventually going to matter here, because it's a useful exercise, and it's not this series seat to sit in. It's a Jackson County grand jury's. 16 to 23 ordinary Mississippi residents, not detectives, not forensic pathologists, not YouTube commentators, are going to be handed the completed state autopsy, the independent autopsy, the tow call, the phone records, the subpoenaed social media, and whatever the audio and oceanography experts eventually produce, and asked a much narrower question than the one this entire online conversation has been having for 5 weeks. Not who's lying. Not was this racially motivated. Just, is there probable cause to believe a specific crime was committed by a specific person? That's a genuinely hard needle to thread with the evidence we've walked through tonight. Real, documented irregularities that would make any reasonable person uneasy, sitting right next to the total absence of a named suspect, a named motive, or a single piece of direct evidence placing any specific person's hands on Nolan Wells at the moment he died. If you found yourself reading through everything in this update, unable to cleanly land on obviously an accident or obviously not, you're not being wishy-washy. You're in roughly the same position a grand jury is going to be in, and honestly, the same position Dr. Mitchell, Sheriff Ledbetter, and Ben Crump are all in too, whatever their public statements sound like. The discomfort of not knowing is the actual accurate state of this case. Everything else is someone trying to sell you certainty they don't have. It's worth setting realistic expectations about what resolution even looks like statistically, because true crime coverage in general has a tendency to imply every case eventually gets solved if enough attention gets paid to it, and that's simply not true. The national homicide clearance rate, the share of cases in which someone is actually arrested, has fallen from more than 90% in the 1960s to somewhere around half of all cases today, depending on which year's FBI data you're looking at, and there are an estimated 250,000 unsolved homicides sitting in departments across the country. More than 100,000 of them accumulated in just the last 20 years. That's the backdrop against which Nolan Wells' case, Daniel Erving's, and Tyler Smith's are all playing out. Public attention, reward money, and outside pressure from figures like Crump and organizations like the NAACP do measurably increase the odds of new information surfacing. That's the entire logic behind a tip line and a six-figure reward, but none of it guarantees an answer. It is entirely possible, however unsatisfying, for a case this covered, this funded, and this pressured to still end in undetermined, permanently. We're saying that now, plainly, rather than letting the sheer volume of this update imply a resolution is inevitable just because we've found this much to report.
Somebody knows something.
That's not our line. It's Ben Crump's, repeated across nearly every public appearance he's made in this case, and it's become something close to the case's own drumbeat, because it's the one claim in this entire story that is simultaneously unverifiable and almost certainly true. 300 people were on Horn Island that day. Someone saw Nolan Wells after the last confirmed sighting. Someone knows why the phone stayed behind. Someone knows what was in the messages that got deleted. Somebody knows something about Daniel Erving's last minutes on that bridge beyond what Lucas Roper eventually admitted. Somebody besides Bryce Chestnut knows what happened on Bluebonnet Drive before shots were fired. In all three cases, the actual bottleneck isn't a lack of forensic capability or legal will. It's a room full of people who were there and haven't said everything they know, for reasons that range from fear to loyalty to plain self-preservation, and a reward fund and a grand jury are both, in their own ways, just different tools built to pry that room open. Before we close, one more real detail about who Nolan Wells was, because it's the kind of specific, sourced fact this entire series is built to protect from getting lost underneath 5 weeks of procedure. Nolan was born August 19, 2007, raised Catholic, baptized at St. Joseph Catholic Church in Moss Point, and worshipped at St. Joseph and later St. Elizabeth Seton in Ocean Springs, a lifelong resident of the town that later marched for him. He had 5 siblings: Carlisha Briscoe, Jalen Briscoe, Jaden Briscoe, Ethan Wansley, and Elmore Wansley Jr. His mother described him as having a gentle, calming spirit, someone who made the people around him feel, in her words, seen, welcome, and valued. And in an obituary detail that is difficult to read without stopping, Nolan had already told people he wanted to become the father of 3 daughters one day, and had already picked their names: Sophia, Charlotte, and Olivia. Those names exist now only as a plan an 18-year-old made for a life he didn't get to have, printed in his own obituary, because the people who loved him wanted the world to know he'd made it. His parents have said they intend to preserve his legacy through a foundation in his name, separate from any reward, lawsuit, or grand jury outcome, something that continues regardless of how the rest of this case resolves. We want to close on something specific because a case like this deserves to end on the person it's actually about rather than on procedure or pattern analysis, however necessary those have been to get through honestly. Christine Wansley stood in a church in Ocean Springs on July 20th and thanked God for 18 years with her son before she had a single confirmed answer about how those 18 years ended. She has since had to watch her own grief get treated by a stranger mailing hate mail to her house as a financial opportunity rather than a mother's loss. Whatever the grand jury eventually finds, accident, homicide, or another undetermined finding sitting in a sealed file somewhere in Jackson County, that fact will not change. A woman raised a son for 18 years, sent him out on a boat for a holiday, and has spent every day since without him and without an answer. That's true regardless of which version of the tow call, the phone, the tissue, or the messages turns out to be the real one. It's true for Tamika Erving in Texas, who sent her son out for an ordinary fishing trip with friends and got a missing persons report instead, still waiting on murder charges she doesn't believe will come. It's true for Tyler Smith's grandmother in Lexington, who has to hold he loved life, and the police say he shot himself in her head at the same time, still saying, in the plainest words available to her, that she doesn't believe her grandson pulled that trigger on himself. 3 mothers and 1 grandmother, 3 different states, 1 holiday weekend, and the same exact sentence available to all of them if you ask what they actually want. Not vengeance, not a particular verdict, just the truth, whatever it turns out to be, spoken plainly by someone with the authority to say it and the willingness to be believed. We'll be back with the next update the moment there's a real one to report, a grand jury date, a toxicology result, a name attached to the deleted messages, whichever comes first. If you want to be there when it does, subscribe to this channel and tell us below which unanswered question from tonight you'd bet resolves first: the phone, the tissue, or the tow call.